There is a mistake that has repeated itself throughout human history, a mistake made by kings, by generals, by governments, by companies, by families, and by ordinary people. It begins when someone gains an advantage over another human being. More money, more influence, more authority, more strength, more connections, more power. And slowly they begin to believe that the difference between them is permanent. They look down at the person beneath them and think, "You are weak, you are insignificant. You cannot challenge me." And perhaps at that particular moment they are right. Perhaps the other person truly is weaker. Perhaps they have fewer resources. Perhaps they have no connections. Perhaps they have nowhere else to go. Perhaps they are afraid, and so the powerful person pushes a little further. Nothing happens, they push again. Still, nothing happens. They humiliate them. Nothing happens, they take advantage of them. Nothing happens. And eventually, the absence of resistance creates a dangerous illusion. They begin to believe, "I can do whatever I want to this person." That is where the mistake begins. Because silence does not always mean weakness. Patience does not always mean surrender. And the person who cannot challenge you today may not remain powerless forever. Human beings change, circumstances change, fortunes change, knowledge grows, confidence develops, relationships shift, power changes hands. And sometimes, the person you push down spends those silent years becoming someone you never expected. This is the danger of underestimating people. You are judging their future using their present condition. And history is filled with people who made that mistake. Consider Abraham Lincoln. Before becoming President of the United States, Lincoln experienced political defeats, financial difficulties, and enormous personal struggles. There were moments in his life when very little suggested that history would remember his name. Someone judging Lincoln during those years might have seen failure. History saw preparation. The man who struggled through defeat eventually became the president who would lead the United States through its greatest internal crisis. Or consider Nelson Mandela. For 27 years, Mandela was imprisoned. Think about what 27 years means. Governments changed, children became adults. Entire lives began and ended while Mandela remained behind prison walls. Those who imprisoned him possessed something he did not: power. They controlled the prison. They controlled the laws. They controlled his movement. They could decide where he slept, when he worked, when he ate, when he saw his family. From the outside, the balance of power appeared absolute. But something strange happened. The prisoner became more powerful as a symbol than many of the people guarding him. The attempt to silence him amplified what he represented. And when Mandela finally walked out of prison in 1990, the world was watching. 4 years later, he became president of South Africa. The prisoner had become president. The people who once controlled where he could walk now lived in a country he helped lead. History had reversed the positions. This does not mean every victim becomes a president. It does not mean suffering automatically produces greatness. Sometimes suffering destroys people. Sometimes bullying leaves wounds that last for decades. Sometimes the person being humiliated never receives the dramatic victory that makes a beautiful historical story. And that is exactly why bullying is dangerous. You do not know what your actions are creating inside another human being. You may be creating fear. You may be creating shame. You may be creating resentment. You may be creating determination. You may be creating an enemy. Or you may be awakening something that was sleeping. The bully rarely thinks this far ahead. The bully thinks about the present. I am stronger now. I have authority now. I have money now. I have the crowd now. I have the advantage now. But there is one word that destroys the bully's entire calculation: now. Because now is temporary. Power has always been temporary. Kings discovered this. Empires discovered this. Business giants discovered this. Political leaders discovered this. And ordinary people discover it every day. The employee you humiliate may eventually leave. The student you ridicule may eventually surpass you. The competitor you dismiss may eventually become stronger. The child you constantly belittle may grow into an adult who wants nothing to do with you. The person who needs you today may build a life where they no longer need you tomorrow. And when that day comes, they will remember how you treated them when the balance of power was different. This is why the smartest people throughout history understood something the bully does not. Power must be controlled. Sun Tzu understood that unnecessary conflict is expensive. Machiavelli understood that fear and hatred are not the same thing. Marcus Aurelius understood that controlling yourself may be more difficult than controlling others. And the Stoics understood that strength without discipline eventually becomes another form of weakness. The truly powerful person does not need to humiliate everyone beneath them. They do not need to prove their strength every morning. They do not need weaker people around them so they can feel important. Because genuine strength does not need constant witnesses. Insecurity does, and perhaps this is the deepest psychology behind bullying. Sometimes the person trying hardest to make others feel small is desperately trying to convince themselves that they are big. They attack weakness because they fear weakness. They demand respect because they do not know how to earn it. They create fear because fear is easier to manufacture than loyalty. But fear has an expiration date. The moment the victim stops being afraid, the bully loses one of their greatest weapons. And sometimes that moment arrives quietly. There is no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no warning. The employee simply begins looking for another job. The student begins working harder. The competitor begins learning. The ignored person begins building. The humiliated person begins changing. While the bully is enjoying today's victory, the person beneath them may be preparing for tomorrow. That is the lesson of this documentary. Not that you should fear everyone. Not that every insult will create revenge. Not that weakness should never be challenged. And certainly not that people should tolerate mistreatment. The lesson is much deeper. Do not abuse temporary advantages. Do not confuse someone's kindness with inability. Do not confuse someone's silence with surrender. Do not assume that because someone needs you today, they will need you forever. And never become so intoxicated by power that you forget the humanity of the person standing beneath you. Because you cannot see another person's entire future. You do not know what they are becoming. You do not know what they are learning. You do not know who they will meet. You do not know what opportunities will appear. You do not know how much strength hardship is developing inside them. You only know who they are today. And today is not forever. So have strength. Build power. Become capable. Defend yourself when necessary. Set boundaries. Refuse to become someone's victim. But when power finally enters your hands, remember what power is for. Do not use strength merely to make weaker people feel smaller. Do not humiliate people simply because there are no immediate consequences. Do not create enemies merely because you can defeat them today. Because one of the oldest mistakes in human history is believing that the balance of power will never change. It changes. It always changes. And sometimes the person everyone ignored becomes the person everyone must eventually listen to. Sometimes the person everyone laughed at becomes the person everyone respects. Sometimes the person standing at the bottom rises, and sometimes the person standing at the top falls. So remember this whenever you have an advantage over another human being. You may be stronger today, you may be richer today, you may be more connected today, you may have authority today. But today is only today. Treat people with dignity while you have power, because character is revealed not by how you treat the people above you, but by how you treat the people who cannot fight back. And perhaps the greatest sign of strength is not having the power to destroy someone. It is having that power and choosing not to abuse it. This is the hidden cost of humiliating others. This is the danger of underestimating human potential. And this is why you should never bully too much. Chapter 1. The Psychology of the Bully. Before we understand the person being bullied, we must understand the person doing the bullying. Because there is something strange about bullying. The bully wants to appear powerful. They want everyone watching to believe, I am strong, I am confident, I am important, I am someone you should fear. But genuine strength does not always behave this way. A genuinely strong person does not need to search constantly for weaker people to dominate. A genuinely intelligent person does not need to make ignorant people feel stupid. A genuinely successful person does not need to humiliate someone who is still struggling. A genuinely confident person does not need an audience every time they demonstrate superiority. So we must ask a deeper question. If bullying is supposedly about strength, why does the bully so often need someone weaker? Why not challenge someone equally powerful? Why choose the quiet student, the inexperienced employee, the isolated colleague, the person with fewer connections, the younger sibling? the person who cannot easily respond. Because bullying is not simply about power, it is about the psychological experience of power. And there is a difference. Human beings have always cared about status. Long before corporations, schools, political parties, and social media existed, our ancestors lived in groups where social position mattered enormously. Status could influence access to resources, protection, partners, information, opportunities, and belonging. We still carry parts of that psychology. The modern symbols have changed. Today, status may come through money, job titles, education, physical appearance, popularity, followers, professional achievements, social connections, or political influence. But underneath all these symbols sits an ancient question. Where do I stand compared with everyone else? There is nothing automatically wrong with wanting status. Ambition can build extraordinary things. The desire to become respected can encourage discipline. Competition can produce excellence. The problem begins when a person discovers another way of feeling superior. Instead of climbing higher, they push someone else lower. Imagine two people standing on separate platforms. One person wants to become taller. They could build their platform. They could learn, work, improve, become stronger, become wiser, become more valuable. But there is another method. Destroy the other person's platform. Suddenly, without growing even 1 centimeter, you appear taller. Psychologically, bullying can work in a similar way. Instead of saying, "How can I become more impressive?" the bully asks, "How can I make someone else look less impressive?" Instead of, "How can I become stronger? How can I make someone feel weaker?" Instead of, "How can I earn respect? How can I create fear?" That distinction takes us to Alfred Adler. Adler was an Austrian physician and psychotherapist who became one of the major early thinkers in psychology. He was fascinated by feelings of inferiority. Adler recognized something almost everyone experiences. Human beings begin life helpless. A child looks around and sees adults who are larger, stronger, more knowledgeable, and more capable. The child must gradually develop competence. In that sense, feelings of inadequacy are not automatically unhealthy. They can become fuel. You realize you are weak, so you train. You realize you do not know, so you study. You realize you lack money, so you develop useful skills. You realize you are inexperienced, so you practice. The feeling of being behind can push a person forward, but there is another possibility. Instead of overcoming inferiority through growth, a person can compensate for it through displays of superiority. They become obsessed with appearing important. They exaggerate achievements. They constantly compare themselves with others. They cannot tolerate criticism. They need weaker people around them. They interpret disagreement as disrespect. And when someone threatens their image of superiority, they react aggressively. This gives us one of the first paradoxes of bullying. The person constantly demonstrating strength may be unusually sensitive to feeling weak. Think about genuine expertise. Imagine a world-class musician watching a beginner make mistakes. Does the expert need to grab the instrument and scream, "Look how much better I am than you"? Probably not. Their competence is already established. Imagine a successful professor humiliating a child because the child cannot understand advanced mathematics. What would that prove? Nothing. The difference in ability is already obvious. Dominating someone significantly weaker often tells us less about strength than the bully believes. Sometimes it reveals the need to experience superiority. And superiority feels especially satisfying when there is an audience. This is important. Bullying is often social. The insult becomes more powerful when other people laugh. The humiliation becomes more rewarding when other people watch. The bully is not merely communicating with the victim. They are communicating with the group. They are saying, "Look at our positions. Look who can attack. Look who must absorb it. Look who matters here." This is why humiliation can become a performance. The victim becomes a stage on which the bully demonstrates status. And once the audience rewards that performance with laughter, attention, approval, or silence, the behavior can become stronger. Human beings learn from consequences. If an action produces a reward, we become more likely to repeat it. A bully insults someone. Everyone laughs. Reward. They humiliate someone. Nobody challenges them. Reward. They intimidate someone. The person obeys. Reward. Slowly, the bully learns this works. And behavior that works tends to continue. That is how small acts of domination can grow. The first insult becomes the second. The second becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes an identity. Eventually, the person may stop asking whether the behavior is right. They only ask whether they can get away with it. This principle extends far beyond schoolyards. A manager humiliates an employee during a meeting. Nobody challenges the manager. The manager learns that humiliation is an acceptable management tool. A powerful family member controls everyone through anger. The family adjusts around that person's temper. The angry person learns that rage produces obedience. A political leader insults opponents and receives applause. The humiliation becomes part of the political performance. A wealthy person treats workers badly and experiences no consequences. They begin believing status gives them permission. Different environments, same psychological mechanism. Power rewarded becomes power repeated. But psychology goes even deeper. Carl Jung introduced another useful idea, the shadow. Jung believed that human beings contain qualities, impulses, fears, and desires they do not always want to acknowledge. We create an image of ourselves. Good, strong, intelligent, moral, confident, but underneath that image may exist parts of ourselves we would rather not examine. Fear, jealousy, insecurity, weakness, envy, the desire for approval, the fear of insignificance. Jung called attention to the danger of denying these hidden parts, because what we refuse to recognize in ourselves can influence how we treat others. Sometimes the quality that irritates us most in another person touches something unresolved inside ourselves. A person deeply afraid of appearing weak may become obsessed with attacking weakness. A person uncertain about intelligence may constantly need to prove that other people are stupid. A person afraid of losing social status may aggressively police who is above and below them. A person secretly insecure about success may take unusual pleasure in another person's failure. The victim becomes a screen onto which the bully projects something they do not want to confront within themselves. This does not explain every bully. Human behavior rarely has one explanation. Some people bully because their environment rewards aggression. Some seek social status. Some imitate behavior they have seen elsewhere. Some enjoy dominance. Some lack empathy. Some are themselves under pressure. And some simply discover that aggression gets them what they want. We should be careful not to romanticize bullying by claiming that every bully is secretly a frightened victim. That would be too simple. Some people know exactly what they are doing. The important point is different. Cruel behavior is not reliable evidence of inner strength, and vulnerability is not reliable evidence of permanent weakness. That distinction matters, because bullies often select targets according to visible vulnerability. The quiet student, the newcomer, the poor employee, the person with an accent, the physically smaller person, the socially isolated person, the beginner, the person who desperately needs the job, the person unlikely to retaliate. This selection reveals something important. The bully calculates risk. Even when the calculation is unconscious, the pattern often says, attack where the cost is low. And that is why many bullies behave very differently around people who can seriously challenge them. Watch how quickly arrogance can become politeness when the balance of power changes. The cruel manager becomes respectful around the company owner. The aggressive student becomes quiet around the head teacher. The person who humiliates service workers becomes charming around influential clients. This tells us something. Sometimes what looks like uncontrolled aggression is actually highly selective aggression. The person knows where power sits. And this creates one of the most important questions in this documentary. What happens when the balance changes? What happens when the employee no longer needs the job? What happens when the student develops confidence? What happens when the ignored competitor gains resources? What happens when the person you have been humiliating develops allies? What happens when the person beneath you finally realizes, you are not as powerful as I thought? Because fear depends partly on perception. The bully's power is not only what they possess, it is also what the victim believes they possess. The moment that perception changes, the relationship can change. And this is where bullying contains the seeds of its own destruction. The bully often becomes addicted to evidence that the strategy works. Silence becomes evidence. Fear becomes evidence. Compliance becomes evidence. Nobody challenging them becomes evidence. Every successful humiliation strengthens the belief, I can keep doing this. But the evidence may be misleading. The employee is not silent because they respect the manager. They are silent because they need the salary. The child is not silent because the parent is correct. They are silent because they have nowhere else to live. The student is not silent because the bully is superior. They are silent because they fear social consequences. The weaker nation is not silent because it accepts humiliation. It may simply lack the ability to respond today. The bully sees behavior. They do not always understand motivation. That mistake can become extremely expensive. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something related to this centuries ago. In The Prince, Machiavelli famously examined the political usefulness of fear. His argument is often reduced to the phrase that it is better to be feared than loved. But the second half of the strategic problem matters just as much. A ruler should avoid becoming hated. That distinction is crucial. Fear can produce obedience. Hatred produces something else. A person who fears you may cooperate while you remain powerful. A person who hates you may wait for your weakness. That is the danger. If your entire system of control depends on being stronger every single day, then you have created a fragile system. You can never become weak. You can never make a mistake. You can never lose authority. You can never need the people beneath you. Because the moment circumstances change, the accumulated resentment may return. This is why respect is strategically different from fear. Respect can survive weakness. Fear often cannot. A respected leader can experience failure and still receive loyalty. A feared leader may discover that loyalty disappears the moment punishment becomes impossible. And this takes us to Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius occupied one of the most powerful positions in the ancient world. He was Roman emperor. Armies moved under imperial authority. Officials obeyed his commands. His decisions affected millions. If anyone could have developed an enormous ego, it was him. Yet when we read his private reflections in Meditations, we encounter a man repeatedly reminding himself not to become corrupted by status. He reminds himself that fame is temporary, that anger distorts judgment, that other people have their own perspectives, that death eventually equalizes emperor and citizen. Marcus understood something the bully forgets. External power is unstable. Self-command is more durable. You can control an employee today and lose the company tomorrow. You can dominate a classroom today and become irrelevant after graduation. You can have political authority today and leave office tomorrow. You can be physically stronger today and grow old tomorrow. But the ability to govern your own impulses travels with you. That is why self-control is a higher form of strength than uncontrolled domination. Anyone with enough power can hurt someone weaker. The difficult achievement is possessing power without becoming intoxicated by it. And perhaps that gives us the clearest distinction between the bully and the strong person. The bully needs weakness around them. The strong person does not. The bully needs an audience. The strong person can stand alone. The bully needs fear. The strong person can earn respect. The bully needs someone beneath them to feel tall. The strong person builds their own height. And most importantly, the bully looks at another person's weakness and sees an opportunity. The strong person looks at another person's weakness and understands responsibility. This does not mean becoming passive. Strength matters. Boundaries matter. The ability to defend yourself matters. There are situations where confrontation is necessary. There are people who interpret endless tolerance as permission. But defending yourself and bullying others are fundamentally different. One protects dignity. The other steals it. One establishes boundaries. The other violates them. One says, "You cannot treat me this way." The other says, "I can treat you however I want." And that distinction will become increasingly important as we continue. Because the central danger of bullying is not simply that the bully may be a bad person. The deeper danger is that power can create bad information. When everyone is afraid to challenge you, you begin believing you are always right. When weaker people constantly obey, you begin believing obedience equals respect. When nobody retaliates, you begin believing nobody ever will. And when every consequence is delayed, you begin believing consequences do not exist. That is how arrogance grows, slowly, quietly, one successful abuse of power at a time, until the person begins believing that temporary superiority is a law of nature. But it is not. The quiet person can gain confidence. The inexperienced person can gain knowledge. The poor person can gain resources. The isolated person can build relationships. The employee can leave. The student can grow. The powerless can organize. And the person everyone underestimated can become something nobody expected. So the first lesson is not merely, do not bully people. The lesson is deeper. Never build your identity around another person's weakness. Because if you need someone else to remain small in order for you to feel big, then their growth becomes your greatest threat. Build strength that does not depend on humiliation. Build confidence that does not require an audience. Build competence that does not require someone else to fail. And when you find yourself with more power than another person, remember, their vulnerability is not permission. It is a test of your character. Because anyone can appear powerful while standing over someone who cannot fight back. The real question is what you become when nobody can stop you. That is where strength ends and character begins. Chapter 2: The Human Need for Respect. There are insults people forget within minutes, and there are humiliations they remember for the rest of their lives. Years can pass, cities can change, careers can change, relationships can change. The person may become older, wealthier, stronger, and more successful, yet somewhere inside their memory remains a moment. A classroom where everyone laughed. A workplace where a manager embarrassed them. A family gathering where someone deliberately made them feel worthless. A relationship where they were constantly reminded that they were not good enough. Sometimes the words themselves disappear, but the feeling remains. Why? Because humiliation attacks something deeper than comfort. It attacks dignity, and dignity occupies a powerful place in human psychology. Human beings need food, water, shelter, safety. But surviving is not enough. We also want to matter. We want to belong. We want to feel competent. We want to believe our existence has value. We want some degree of control over our lives. And we want recognition from the people around us. This does not mean everyone wants fame. Most people do not need thousands of people applauding them. But almost everyone wants something much simpler. To be treated as though they are human. This is where bullying becomes psychologically dangerous. Because bullying does not merely say, I disagree with you. It often says you are beneath me. That message can reach deeply into human identity. The psychologist Abraham Maslow placed esteem among the important human needs in his famous hierarchy. His model has been debated, modified, and sometimes oversimplified, but one insight remains useful. Human beings care deeply about competence, recognition, achievement, and respect. Take away food and the body suffers. Take away safety and fear grows. But repeatedly attack someone's dignity, and something else begins happening. Their relationship with themselves can change. To understand why, we need to distinguish between two experiences that are often confused: guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. That difference is enormous. Imagine a child fails an examination. A teacher could say, you did not prepare properly. We need to improve your study habits. That statement addresses behavior. Something can be changed. But imagine the teacher says, you are stupid, you will never become anything. Now the message has changed. The failure is no longer something the child experienced. The failure has become the child's identity. One says you made a mistake, the other says you are the mistake. That is the psychological cruelty of humiliation. It turns behavior into identity. And when humiliation is repeated long enough, people can begin internalizing the message. Maybe I really am stupid. Maybe I really am ugly. Maybe I really am useless. Maybe nobody will respect me. Maybe I deserve this. This is why bullying can continue long after the bully has disappeared. Eventually, the victim may begin performing the bully's job internally. The bully leaves the room, but the voice remains. Years later, an opportunity appears, and before the person tries, something inside says, people like you cannot do that. They enter a room filled with confident people. Something says, you do not belong here. They make one mistake. Something says, there it is, they were right about you. The original bully may have forgotten everything. The victim may still be carrying the conversation. That is the hidden cost of humiliation. But there is another possible response. Humiliation does not always produce submission. Sometimes it produces resistance. Sometimes the same sentence that destroys one person's confidence becomes another person's fuel. You cannot do it. One person hears that and gives up. Another person hears it and thinks, watch me. This does not mean humiliation is useful. It means human beings respond to pain differently. And that unpredictability is exactly why humiliating people is dangerous. You do not know what you are creating. Fear, shame, hatred, ambition, withdrawal, resentment, determination, sometimes several at once. To understand the power of dignity on a much larger scale, consider South Africa under apartheid. Apartheid was not simply a collection of discriminatory laws. It was a political and social system that classified people by race and distributed rights, opportunities, movement, residence, and political power accordingly. Millions of black South Africans lived under a system that formally treated them as unequal citizens. That matters psychologically. Because oppression is not only about what people are prevented from doing, it is also about the message the system communicates. You are less important. Your choices matter less. Your voice matters less. Your dignity matters less. Among those who resisted that system was Nelson Mandela. In 1964, Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend 27 years behind bars. Think carefully about the imbalance of power. The state had prisons, police, courts, laws, weapons, institutions. Mandela had almost none of those things. Physically, the state controlled his environment. It could determine where he slept, when he worked, when he received visitors, when he could communicate. By ordinary measures of power, the difference appeared enormous. Yet something happened that illustrates the limits of coercion. Mandela's imprisonment did not erase the political problem. It did not erase the demand for equality. And over time, Mandela himself became an increasingly powerful international symbol. The prisoner gained moral influence while still physically confined. That is an extraordinary contradiction. The body was controlled. The symbol was not. The state could restrict movement. It could not completely determine meaning. And eventually, the political environment changed. Mandela was released in 1990. Apartheid legislation was dismantled. In 1994, South Africa held its first fully democratic national election, and Mandela became president. Again, we should resist turning history into a simple motivational story. Apartheid did not end because one man simply remained positive. The struggle involved generations of activists, organizations, workers, communities, international pressure, political negotiations, economic forces, violence, sacrifice, and changing conditions inside and outside South Africa. History is always more complicated than inspirational storytelling. But Mandela's life demonstrates something important about dignity. Physical power and moral power are not always the same thing. You can control someone's circumstances without completely controlling what they believe themselves to be. And sometimes attempts to humiliate people strengthen the very identity you hope to destroy. This principle appears everywhere. A manager constantly reminds employees, "You are lucky to work here." Perhaps they believe this creates gratitude, but repeated disrespect can produce the opposite. Employees begin imagining life somewhere else. A controlling partner constantly says, "Nobody else will want you." Perhaps they believe this creates dependence. But eventually the person may realize the statement was designed to maintain control. A parent constantly tells a child, "You are useless." Perhaps they believe harshness creates discipline. Instead, they may create an adult who spends decades trying to recover confidence, or an adult determined never to depend on that parent again. The person using humiliation sees only the immediate effect, the silence, the lowered eyes, the obedience. What they cannot see is the internal calculation. Something is changing, and one of the most important forces in that calculation is resentment. Resentment is complicated. It can be destructive. A person can carry resentment for years and allow it to poison their life. But resentment also tells us something. It often emerges when people believe they have been treated unfairly and cannot adequately respond. The emotion says, "This should not have happened. I was treated beneath what I believe I deserved." And when people cannot correct the situation directly, the memory can remain active. This is one reason public humiliation is especially dangerous. An insult in private attacks the person. An insult in front of others attacks the person's social position. Now there are witnesses. The victim does not merely feel pain. They feel exposed. The bully understands this instinctively. That is why an audience matters. The bully often wants laughter. The laughter confirms hierarchy. One person attacks, others laugh. The victim stands alone. For a moment, the entire social structure seems visible. Who is powerful? Who is accepted? Who is outside? But there is a hidden danger in public humiliation. The audience remembers too. People learn something about the bully. They learn, if this person can do that to them, they can do it to me. Fear may increase, but trust decreases. This distinction matters enormously in leadership. Fear can produce compliance. Trust produces cooperation. A manager who humiliates employees may get immediate obedience. People stop challenging them. Meetings become quiet. Nobody disagrees. From the manager's perspective, everything looks excellent. Finally, everyone respects me. But perhaps nobody respects them. Perhaps everyone has simply learned that honesty is dangerous. Now the leader has created a new problem. They no longer receive accurate information. Employees hide mistakes. People avoid difficult conversations. Bad news travels slowly upward. Everyone tells the leader what the leader wants to hear. The bully believes they have gained control. In reality, they have damaged their access to truth. This is one of the great paradoxes of intimidation. The more afraid people become of telling you the truth, the less accurately you understand your own environment. This happens in families, organizations, governments, businesses, even friendships. If every disagreement becomes humiliation, people eventually stop disagreeing openly. But silence does not mean agreement. Sometimes it means there is no point talking to you anymore. And once people reach that conclusion, the relationship has already begun changing. Confucius understood that relationships require more than authority. His philosophy emphasized duties flowing in multiple directions. The ruler had obligations, the parent had obligations, the child had obligations, the official had obligations. Order was not supposed to mean unlimited domination by whoever occupied the highest position. Roles carried responsibilities. This is important because authority without responsibility becomes exploitation. A parent has more power than a young child. That creates responsibility. A teacher has more knowledge than a student. That creates responsibility. A manager has authority over employees. That creates responsibility. A government has coercive power over citizens. That creates responsibility. Whenever there is an imbalance of power, the stronger side faces a moral test. What will you do with the advantage? Will you use it to develop or dominate, correct or humiliate, protect or exploit? This brings us to a distinction that must remain clear throughout this documentary. Respect does not mean softness. You can fire an employee respectfully. You can punish misconduct without humiliation. You can tell someone they are wrong. You can enforce standards. You can refuse unreasonable demands. You can defend yourself. You can end relationships. You can compete aggressively. You can defeat an opponent. Respect does not require pretending everyone is correct. It requires recognizing that disagreement does not remove humanity. This is especially important with children. Children need correction. Without boundaries, children can become irresponsible. But correction and humiliation produce very different lessons. Correction says, your behavior has consequences. Humiliation says, your existence is embarrassing. One teaches responsibility, the other can teach shame. The same principle applies to adults. A good manager says, this work does not meet the standard. A humiliating manager says, how could someone be this useless? The first gives information. The second attacks identity. And here we encounter another reason humiliation is strategically foolish. People perform better when they can separate failure from identity. If failure means, I made a mistake, then the mind can ask, how do I fix it? If failure means, I am worthless, then the problem becomes much larger. The goal should be improvement, not psychological destruction. Yet some people deliberately choose destruction because humiliation gives them something ordinary correction does not. Superiority. Correction improves the other person. Humiliation elevates the bully, at least temporarily. That is why the difference matters. Ask yourself whenever you criticize someone, am I trying to solve the problem? Or am I enjoying the feeling of being above them? That question exposes a great deal, because sometimes we disguise ego as discipline. We tell ourselves, I am teaching them a lesson. But the lesson ended 5 minutes ago. Everything after that was humiliation. Sometimes parents do it, sometimes teachers do it, sometimes bosses do it, sometimes older siblings do it, sometimes powerful countries do it, sometimes entire cultures do it. The punishment continues long after the behavior has been corrected because the person with power has begun enjoying the demonstration, and that is where discipline becomes domination. There is another reason respect matters. Human beings remember how people treated them during vulnerable moments. Success attracts respect easily. When you become wealthy, people become polite. When you become influential, people suddenly remember your name. When you become powerful, everyone discovers your good qualities. But the people we remember differently are those who respected us before any of that happened. The teacher who believed in us when we were struggling. The friend who stayed when we had nothing. The manager who corrected us without humiliating us. The stranger who treated us with dignity when there was nothing to gain. Why do those memories become powerful? Because respect given to the powerless feels different from respect given to the powerful. One may be strategic, the other reveals character. Anyone can respect a king. How do you treat the servant? Anyone can respect the owner. How do you treat the cleaner? Anyone can respect the famous person. How do you treat the person nobody knows? That is the test, because the bully's respect moves upward. They respect power. They demand obedience downward. The mature person's respect moves in both directions. They can recognize hierarchy without confusing hierarchy with human worth. And that brings us back to dignity. Dignity does not mean everyone has equal talent. They do not. People differ enormously in intelligence, discipline, skill, achievement, wealth, strength, and judgment. Dignity means those differences do not give us unlimited permission to humiliate. The beginner may be less skilled than the expert. They are still human. The employee may have less authority than the manager. They are still human. The child may understand less than the parent. They are still human. The defeated opponent may have lost. They are still human. This is one of civilization's great achievements, the idea that power should have limits. Because without limits, strength becomes tyranny, and tyranny eventually creates resistance. Sometimes resistance is loud, protest, confrontation, rebellion. Sometimes resistance is quiet. The employee stops caring, the child stops sharing, the partner emotionally withdraws, the customer leaves, the citizen loses trust, the student stops asking questions, the friend stops calling. Nothing dramatic happens. The relationship simply dies, and often the powerful person notices only when it is too late. They ask, why did they leave? Why don't they talk to me anymore? Why is everyone against me? Why didn't anyone warn me? Perhaps people did. But humiliation taught them to remain silent. That is why respect is not merely morality. It is intelligence. Respect keeps communication open. Respect allows correction without creating unnecessary enemies. Respect allows strength without hatred. Respect allows authority without psychological destruction. And most importantly, respect recognizes something the bully repeatedly forgets. The person in front of you has an inner world you cannot fully see. They have memories, fears, ambitions, limits, dreams, and a sense of dignity. You may control what happens in the room. You do not completely control what happens inside them. That is where the next chapter begins. Because sometimes people who are being humiliated do not respond. They remain quiet. They lower their eyes. They walk away. And the bully celebrates. They think, look, they did nothing. But silence is one of the most misunderstood human behaviors. Sometimes silence is fear. Sometimes silence is helplessness. Sometimes silence is discipline. And sometimes silence is preparation. Chapter 3. Why people stay silent. Silence is dangerous to misunderstand. When someone insults another person and receives no response, they often make an immediate conclusion. They are afraid of me. When a manager humiliates an employee and the employee lowers their head, the manager may think they know their place. When a bully attacks someone at school and the victim walks away, the bully may think they are weak. When a powerful person repeatedly pushes someone who refuses to retaliate, they may eventually convince themselves, this person will never fight back. But silence does not have one meaning. Sometimes silence is weakness. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it is confusion. Sometimes it is exhaustion. Sometimes it is wisdom. And sometimes it is strategy. The problem is that all these forms of silence can look exactly the same from the outside. Imagine two people walking away from identical confrontations. The first walks away because they are terrified. The second walks away because they have decided the confrontation is not worth the cost. Same behavior, completely different psychology. This distinction is important because human beings constantly mistake restraint for inability. We assume that because someone does not do something, they cannot do it. But there is a tremendous difference between I cannot respond and I choose not to respond. The first is powerlessness. The second may be power under control. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca spent considerable time thinking about anger. He understood that anger creates a strange illusion. When we are furious, immediate action feels like strength. We want to respond now, insult now, attack now, punish now, prove ourselves now. But anger narrows judgment. It makes the present moment feel more important than the future consequences. That is why emotional restraint can be a form of intelligence. If another person can determine when you become angry, they can influence your behavior. One insult, and you react. One provocation, and you lose control. One disrespectful comment, and suddenly they are deciding what you do next. That is not freedom. That is emotional dependence. The person who controls your emotions does not need to control your body. They only need to know which button to press. This is why restraint matters. Not every insult deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every disagreement deserves a battle. And not every opponent deserves access to your attention. But this principle can easily be misunderstood. There is a difference between restraint and submission. There is a difference between choosing your battles and being afraid to establish boundaries. There is a difference between patience and allowing someone to destroy you. Wisdom lies in knowing which situation you are facing. This is where Sun Tzu becomes useful. More than 2,000 years ago, the Chinese military tradition associated with Sun Tzu produced one of history's most influential works on strategy, The Art of War. Its subject was warfare. But beneath the military language lies a broader principle. Conflict should serve an objective. You do not fight merely because an opponent offers you a battle. You fight because fighting advances your position. That sounds obvious. But emotionally, human beings violate this principle constantly. Someone insults us, we respond. Someone challenges our ego, we respond. Someone posts something offensive, we respond. Someone tries to provoke us, we respond. Suddenly, another person has chosen the battlefield, the timing, and the subject, and we have obediently arrived. The strategist asks a different question. What happens if I refuse to play? Sometimes walking away is not retreat. It is refusing to fight on someone else's terms. Sun Tzu understood that the highest forms of strategy involve achieving objectives without unnecessary destruction, because every battle has a cost. Even battles you win: time, energy, money, reputation, relationships, attention, opportunity. The immature person counts victories. The strategist counts costs. This is why a quiet response can sometimes be intelligent. But there is another side of silence, a darker side. Sometimes people stay silent because they have begun believing resistance is useless. This takes us to the psychologist Martin Seligman and research associated with learned helplessness. The basic idea is unsettling. When living beings repeatedly experience negative conditions they cannot control, they may eventually stop attempting to escape even when possibilities later appear. The precise science and application to humans are more complex than the simplified version often repeated in motivational literature. But the underlying insight is important. Repeated experiences of powerlessness can alter expectations. A person begins thinking, nothing I do matters. Imagine an employee working under an abusive manager. The first time they are humiliated, they defend themselves. The manager punishes them. The second time they report the behavior. Nothing happens. The third time they seek support. Nobody wants to get involved. Eventually the employee learns something, not necessarily that the manager is right, but that resistance appears expensive and ineffective, so they stop resisting. From the manager's perspective, something wonderful seems to have happened. The employee has finally learned respect. But perhaps the employee has learned something entirely different. There is no point talking. That difference matters. Compliance is not respect, silence is not agreement, obedience is not loyalty, and absence of resistance is not proof that the system is healthy. Sometimes it is proof that people have stopped believing change is possible. This pattern can appear in families. A child tries to explain themselves. The parent refuses to listen. The child tries again. They are punished for talking back. Eventually, the child becomes quiet. The parent thinks, finally, discipline. But years later, the parent wonders, why doesn't my son tell me anything? Why doesn't my daughter ask me for advice? Why did they move away and become emotionally distant? The answer may have begun decades earlier. The child learned speaking honestly is dangerous, so silence became protection. This is why people sometimes appear suddenly to change. They did not change suddenly. You simply did not hear the internal conversation. A relationship ends. One person is shocked. Where did this come from? But perhaps the other person had been leaving psychologically for years. An employee resigns. The manager is shocked. Why didn't they say something? Perhaps they did. Then they stopped. A friendship disappears. A business partnership collapses. A political movement erupts. Observers describe the event as sudden. But many explosions are only sudden if you ignored the pressure building beforehand. Silence can hide enormous movement. Think about a volcano. From the surface, almost nothing happens. The mountain sits quietly. People build houses nearby. Children grow up beneath it. Years pass, nothing. The absence of eruption becomes evidence of safety. Then pressure that has been accumulating underground reaches a threshold. The eruption appears sudden, but the process was not sudden. Only the visible part was. Human beings can work the same way. A person may tolerate humiliation for years. They do not respond, they do not complain, they do not fight. Then one day they say, enough. Everyone asks what happened. But the better question is, what has been happening for the last 5 years? This is why wise people pay attention before the explosion. They notice withdrawal. They notice changes in behavior. They notice when people stop offering opinions. They notice when laughter disappears. They notice when someone who once argued suddenly becomes indifferent. Indifference can be more dangerous to a relationship than anger. Anger still contains engagement. The angry employee still cares enough to complain. The angry partner still cares enough to argue. The angry citizen still believes something might change. But when people stop caring, something deeper may have broken. This is why the bully should be careful when the victim becomes completely quiet. The bully may interpret silence as victory, but sometimes silence means the victim has stopped negotiating. There is another form of silence, strategic silence. This person has not given up, they are preparing. Perhaps they lack power today. They know it. And instead of pretending otherwise, they begin building. They study, they save money, they develop skills, they build relationships, they improve their health, they gather information, they wait. From the outside, nothing dramatic happens. The bully continues believing the old hierarchy remains intact. But underneath the surface, the balance is changing. This is one reason transformation often surprises people. They see the result without seeing the preparation. A successful company appears suddenly, but perhaps its founders spent 10 years learning. An athlete becomes dominant. People see the championship. They do not see thousands of hours of training. A person leaves poverty. Observers see the new life. They do not see years of saving, studying, failing, adjusting, and trying again. The visible breakthrough is often only the final stage of an invisible process. Steve Jobs experienced one of the most famous professional reversals in modern business history. He helped build Apple. Then, after internal conflict, he left the company in 1985. Imagine the psychological experience. You help create something. It becomes successful. Then you find yourself outside it. To the public, the story could have ended there. Founder loses company. Failure. But Jobs' years away from Apple were not empty. He founded Next. He became involved with Pixar. He gained experience. He made mistakes. He developed. Then circumstances changed. Apple acquired Next in 1997. Jobs returned. And eventually he again became the central figure in the company he had once lost. The point is not that every rejection produces a triumphant comeback. Most do not. The point is that someone's weakest looking period may contain development you cannot see. The person who appears defeated may still be moving. This is where the bully makes another strategic mistake. They assume the victim's identity is fixed. You were weak yesterday. Therefore you will be weak tomorrow. But strength can be learned. Money can be earned. Knowledge can be acquired. Confidence can be rebuilt. Social networks can expand. Institutions can change. Technology can shift power. The person who lacks options today may have 10 options 5 years from now. And this is why temporary dependence should never be confused with permanent submission. A young employee may need the manager. A student may need the teacher. A child may need the parent. A small company may need the large client. A developing nation may need a powerful trading partner. But dependence changes. And when it changes, people remember. This brings us to patience. Patience is one of the most misunderstood virtues. People often imagine patience as doing nothing. But real patience can be highly active. A farmer waiting for harvest is not doing nothing. The field has been prepared. Seeds have been planted. Conditions are being monitored. Waiting is part of the process. A strategist can behave similarly. They understand, this is not the moment. That sentence requires maturity, because ego wants immediate satisfaction. Ego wants the insult answered now, the disrespect punished now, the victory displayed now. Patience accepts delayed satisfaction for a better outcome. But patience requires one additional ingredient, a limit. Because patience without boundaries can become self-destruction. There are situations where silence protects you, and situations where silence enables the bully. There are moments to walk away, and moments to speak, moments to ignore, and moments to document, moments to forgive, and moments to leave, moments to negotiate, and moments to seek help. Wisdom is not endless silence. Wisdom is choosing the response that protects your long-term interests and dignity. This matters especially for someone experiencing real bullying. The lesson should never be, stay quiet until you become powerful. Sometimes silence makes the situation worse. Seeking support can be essential. Talking to trusted people, documenting behavior, using institutional procedures, setting clear boundaries where safe, leaving dangerous environments when possible. Strength is not measured by how much abuse you can tolerate. Sometimes the strongest decision is admitting, this situation is damaging me, and I need help. There is no honor in allowing another person's cruelty to destroy your life merely so you can call yourself tough. The purpose of patience is not suffering. The purpose is judgment. And this brings us back to the bully. The bully sees the surface. They see no response, no confrontation, no retaliation. And they create a story. I have broken them. But they do not know which kind of silence they are looking at. Fear, helplessness, discipline, planning, indifference, preparation. That uncertainty should create humility. Because one of the most dangerous things you can do is continue pushing someone when you do not understand why they are not responding. Perhaps they are afraid. Perhaps they are calculating. Perhaps they are building. Perhaps they are simply waiting until they no longer need you. And perhaps the bully will discover the answer only when the relationship changes. There is an old strategic principle worth remembering. Never assume that because your opponent is not moving, nothing is happening. Stillness can hide preparation. And this principle extends beyond conflict. Your own quiet periods matter too. You do not need to announce every plan. You do not need to prove every improvement. You do not need everyone to understand what you are building. Sometimes growth requires privacy. Read quietly, train quietly, save quietly, learn quietly, build quietly. Not because secrecy itself is powerful, but because attention can distract from development. Let results eventually speak. And if you have been underestimated, resist the temptation to make your entire life about revenge. The bully should not become the architect of your future. If everything you build is designed to make them regret what they did, they still control you. Your goal is larger. Become capable because capability gives you freedom. Become educated because knowledge expands choices. Build financial stability because options protect dignity. Develop emotional discipline because not every provocation deserves ownership of your mind. Build relationships because isolation increases vulnerability. And develop enough self-respect to know when patience has reached its limit. Because eventually every long period of silence reaches a question. Do I continue, or do I change something? That question is the beginning of the breaking point. And breaking points are dangerous because they are rarely visible before they arrive. The bully sees another ordinary day, another insult, another humiliation, another victory. But somewhere inside the person being pushed, a line may have been crossed, not necessarily a line that leads to violence, a line that leads to decision. I am leaving, I am reporting this, I am changing, I am building something else, I am no longer accepting this. The bully believes nothing happened, but everything happened. A decision was made. And once a human being makes a genuine decision that their current situation cannot continue, the balance of power has already begun to change. That is where we go next, because every system of pressure eventually encounters a limit. Every relationship has boundaries. Every person has thresholds. And the most dangerous mistake of power is believing that because someone tolerated yesterday, they will tolerate tomorrow. Chapter 4: The Breaking Point. There is a moment in many human conflicts when something changes. Nothing may look different from the outside. The room is the same, the people are the same. The balance of power appears unchanged. The bully still has authority. The manager still has the position. The controlling partner still believes they have control. The powerful person still believes the weaker person will tolerate another insult. But somewhere inside the person being pushed, a decision has been made. Enough. That word can change everything. Because human beings can tolerate extraordinary amounts of difficulty when they believe the situation is temporary, meaningful, or capable of improving. People endure difficult training because they believe it will make them stronger. They endure demanding education because they believe knowledge will create opportunity. They work difficult jobs because the income supports something important. They sacrifice for children, families, businesses, countries, dreams. Human beings can tolerate enormous pressure when suffering appears connected to purpose. But humiliation is different, especially humiliation that appears endless. When a person begins believing, "This will never improve, they will never respect me, nothing I do will be enough. My silence only encourages them." Then patience can begin transforming into resistance. The breaking point is rarely created by one dramatic event. Usually, it is accumulation. One insult, then another. One broken promise, then another. One public humiliation, then another. One unfair decision, then another. The individual events may appear small, but human beings do not experience every event in isolation. Memory connects them. The 10th insult contains echoes of the previous 9. The 20th humiliation carries the weight of the first 19. That is why the final incident can appear strangely insignificant to outsiders. Someone quits a job because of one comment. Someone ends a friendship because of one argument. Someone leaves a relationship after one apparently minor disagreement. Observers ask, all this because of that? No, not because of that, because of everything that came before it. The final event was simply the last weight placed on an already overloaded structure. Engineers understand this principle. A structure does not necessarily fail because the final load is enormous. It can fail because the final load arrives after years of stress, fatigue, deterioration, and accumulated damage. The collapse is visible, the weakening was not. Human relationships can behave similarly. We notice the resignation. We do not notice the 1,000 moments that produced it. We notice the divorce. We do not notice years of emotional withdrawal. We notice the protest. We do not notice decades of frustration. We notice the confrontation. We do not notice every swallowed response that came before it. This is why wise people do not wait for collapse before paying attention. They watch the stress accumulating. Psychologists Edward Dexey and Richard Ryan developed self-determination theory, one of the influential frameworks for understanding human motivation. At its center are 3 important psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy concerns the experience of having meaningful choice and agency. Competence concerns feeling capable of interacting effectively with the world. Relatedness concerns connection and belonging. Now think about what prolonged bullying attacks. Autonomy. You feel controlled. Competence. You are repeatedly told that you are incapable. Relatedness. You may be isolated, rejected, or publicly humiliated. Bullying can strike at several psychological needs simultaneously. And when people feel that their agency is being constantly taken away, they often begin searching for ways to restore it. Sometimes that restoration is healthy. They establish boundaries. They seek help. They leave. They become financially independent. They build competence. They develop relationships outside the controlling environment. Sometimes the response is unhealthy revenge, self-destruction, aggression, hatred. This is why pushing people toward breaking points is dangerous. You cannot fully control what happens after the threshold is crossed. The person applying pressure imagines they control the system because they controlled the beginning. But once reactions become intense, the situation can escape everyone. History offers countless examples of authorities learning this lesson. Consider the American colonies in the 18th century. The American Revolution is often compressed into a simple slogan about taxation, but the conflict was much larger. Questions of political authority, representation, imperial control, taxation, trade, local autonomy, and constitutional rights accumulated over years. Events that might have been manageable separately began reinforcing one another. The Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, the Boston Tea Party, the coercive acts. Each event changed the political environment. Each reaction influenced the next. Neither side woke up one morning at the beginning of the dispute, knowing exactly where history would end. That is the nature of escalation. People respond to previous responses. Pressure produces resistance. Resistance produces stronger pressure. Stronger pressure produces stronger resistance. Eventually, the original disagreement becomes almost unrecognizable. This is one reason intelligent leadership requires knowing when to stop escalating. Victory in one confrontation may make the larger conflict worse. You can win the argument and destroy the relationship, win the disciplinary battle and lose the employee, win control over the child and lose their trust, win today's political confrontation and radicalize tomorrow's opposition. The question is not merely, can I force compliance? The better question is, what will this compliance cost me later? This is where bullies often fail. They calculate immediate consequences, not accumulated consequences. They ask, can I get away with this today? Instead of, what kind of relationship am I creating over time? That difference separates domination from leadership. A leader thinks about systems. A bully thinks about moments. The same pattern can be seen in South Africa. Apartheid did not collapse because of one protest, one leader, one sanction, one negotiation, or one event. Its eventual dismantling emerged from a long and complicated interaction of internal resistance, mass organization, economic pressures, international isolation, political changes, armed conflict, negotiations, and shifting calculations among different actors. For decades, the apartheid state possessed enormous coercive power, but coercive power did not eliminate opposition. In many cases, repression intensified grievances, organizations adapted, new generations became politically active, international pressure increased, economic costs grew. The system could impose enormous suffering, but imposing suffering and creating permanent political stability are not the same thing. Eventually, negotiation became part of the path forward. Nelson Mandela was released in 1990. Formal negotiation accelerated, and in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election based on universal adult suffrage. The lesson is not that every oppressed group inevitably wins. History does not guarantee justice. Many oppressed people have suffered without seeing liberation. The lesson is more precise. Force can suppress behavior without eliminating the conditions that produced resistance. You can silence a complaint without solving the problem. That distinction appears everywhere. Imagine a company where employees repeatedly complain about working conditions. Management threatens anyone who speaks. Complaints disappear, management celebrates, problem solved. But perhaps nothing had been solved. Employees simply stopped complaining internally. Now they begin leaving, or performing badly, or quietly searching for competitors. The noise disappeared. The problem remained. This is one of the great dangers of authoritarian personalities. They often measure success by the absence of visible opposition. Nobody challenges me, therefore everyone agrees. Nobody complains, therefore everyone is satisfied. Nobody fights back, therefore everyone accepts my authority. But silence can be produced by fear, and fear suppresses information. Eventually, reality returns through another channel. Turnover, failure, withdrawal, resistance, collapse. The breaking point in an individual works similarly. At first, the person tries to preserve the relationship. They explain, they negotiate, they forgive, they rationalize. Maybe they did not mean it. Maybe things will improve. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I should be more patient. Then something changes. Hope disappears. This is often more important than anger. As long as someone believes the relationship can improve, they may continue investing in it. When they stop believing improvement is possible, their behavior changes. They stop trying to repair. They begin preparing to exit. This is why one of the most dangerous sentences in any relationship is not, "I hate you." It is, "I don't care anymore." Hatred still contains attachment. Indifference can mean the connection is already dying, and bullies often discover this too late. They become accustomed to emotional reactions, crying, arguing, complaining, defending. Then one day, none of it happens. The person becomes calm. The bully thinks, finally, they understand. Perhaps, or perhaps they have emotionally left. This is where we must discuss humiliation carefully. Humiliation is not simply pain. It is pain combined with perceived loss of dignity, and dignity can motivate powerful responses. History contains examples where humiliation became politically explosive. Families contain examples where humiliation created lifelong estrangement. Workplaces contain examples where talented employees left because they could tolerate demanding work but not disrespect. Relationships collapse for similar reasons. People can endure hardship with someone who respects them. They struggle to endure contempt. Contempt sends a message. You are beneath consideration. And once contempt enters a relationship, repair becomes difficult. This does not mean every offended person is justified. People can feel humiliated when they are simply being corrected. Some people interpret boundaries as disrespect. Some interpret disagreement as attack. Some use the language of dignity to avoid accountability. So we need a distinction. Correction says, your behavior must change. Humiliation says, your worth is lower than mine. Healthy authority can be firm, sometimes extremely firm. A judge can impose punishment. A manager can terminate employment. A parent can establish consequences. A teacher can fail a student who has not met the standard. Strength is not cruelty merely because someone dislikes the consequence. The issue is whether power is being used toward a legitimate purpose or toward psychological domination. This distinction matters because our documentary is not arguing for endless softness. A world without consequences would quickly become dysfunctional. People need boundaries. Institutions need standards. Wrongdoing needs accountability. The argument is against unnecessary humiliation, the extra insult, the public degradation, the pleasure in another person's weakness, the repeated attack after the lesson has already been delivered. That excess creates enemies without creating value. And sometimes the person being humiliated eventually decides to restore dignity. The healthiest form of restoration is not revenge, it is independence. This is where the story becomes personally important. Suppose someone controls you because you depend entirely on them financially. Your strongest long-term response may not be fighting every day. It may be developing financial independence. Suppose someone humiliates you because you lack professional skills. The response may be education. Suppose a group excludes you. The response may be building healthier relationships elsewhere. Suppose someone constantly attacks your confidence. The response may be developing enough internal stability that their opinion no longer determines your identity. This is transformation. And transformation is more powerful than revenge because revenge still centers the bully. Revenge says, my future will be organized around what you did to me. Transformation says, what you did will become one chapter in a much larger story. That distinction matters because there is a dangerous temptation at the breaking point. When someone has been humiliated for years, revenge can feel like justice. You hurt me, now I will hurt you. You embarrassed me, now I will embarrass you. You made me powerless. Now that I have power, I will make you powerless. Emotionally, the logic feels satisfying, but it reproduces the same structure. Only the positions change. The victim becomes the bully. The oppressed becomes the oppressor. The cycle survives. The names change. This is why Nelson Mandela's political symbolism became so powerful. After 27 years of imprisonment, he emerged into a country carrying enormous racial fear and resentment. There were legitimate demands for justice. There was also the possibility of catastrophic retaliation. Mandela's emphasis on reconciliation did not erase the past. Nor did post-apartheid South Africa magically solve its inequalities. It did something more immediate. It helped communicate that political transformation did not have to mean indiscriminate revenge. That required extraordinary restraint. And restraint after gaining power is often more difficult than restraint while powerless. When you are powerless, you may have no choice. When you finally have the ability to retaliate, character becomes visible. This gives us an important principle. The breaking point should not be the moment you become what you hated. It should be the moment you decide something must change. Perhaps the environment changes. Perhaps you leave. Perhaps you seek support. Perhaps you become stronger. Perhaps you establish boundaries. Perhaps you expose wrongdoing through legitimate channels. Perhaps you simply stop giving another person access to your life. But the goal is freedom, not obsession. There is a profound difference between defeating someone and becoming free from them. If you spend the next 20 years thinking about revenge, the bully still occupies your mind. If every achievement is designed to make them jealous, they still influence your identity. If every relationship is shaped by what happened, the past still controls the present. Real victory eventually requires emotional separation. You remember the lesson, but you release the prison. This is why the best response to humiliation is often not, one day I will destroy you. It is one day you will no longer have the power to determine my life. That is a much greater ambition, and sometimes that ambition begins at the breaking point. The moment when someone says, enough, not loudly, not violently, not dramatically, simply with clarity, I need another life. That sentence has built businesses, ended destructive relationships, created educational journeys, started political movements, broken family cycles. and transformed individuals, because human beings can tolerate enormous difficulty until they see an alternative. Once an alternative becomes visible, the old system begins losing power. That is why knowledge matters, why money matters, why skills matter, why relationships matter, why confidence matters. Each one creates options, and options reduce dependence. The bully's greatest advantage is often not strength. It is the victim's belief that there is nowhere else to go. The moment another path appears, control weakens. So if you find yourself in the stronger position, understand what this means. Do not interpret dependence as loyalty. Do not interpret fear as respect. Do not interpret silence as consent. And do not push people merely because they have nowhere else to go today, because today's dependency may become tomorrow's memory. And people remember who protected their dignity when they were vulnerable. They also remember who exploited vulnerability because they believed consequences would never arrive. Every person has a threshold. Every relationship has a threshold. Every institution has a threshold. The wise person does not discover that threshold by deliberately pushing until something breaks. They understand limits before collapse. Because once the breaking point arrives, you may no longer control what happens next. And sometimes the person you pushed does something far more consequential than fighting back. They change. They become disciplined. They become independent. They become capable. They become someone who no longer needs your approval, your permission, your resources, or your acceptance. And then the person who once seemed weak begins to reveal something the bully never expected: potential. That is where we go next. Because history is filled with people who were judged too early, rejected too early, mocked too early, dismissed too early. People whose weakest chapter was mistaken for their entire story. And sometimes, being underestimated became the beginning of their transformation. Chapter 5: The Revenge of the Underestimated. There is something dangerous about judging a human being too early. You meet someone during the worst period of their life. They have no money, no influence, no confidence, no reputation. Perhaps they are still learning. Perhaps they have failed repeatedly. Perhaps nobody important knows their name. And from this small window into their existence, you make a permanent conclusion. This person is going nowhere. It is one of the easiest mistakes to make, because human beings naturally judge what they can see. We see the current position. We do not see the trajectory. We see the result. We do not see the process. We see the person standing in front of us today. We do not see who they may become after 5 years of discipline, 10 years of learning, 20 years of experience. That is why underestimation can be so dangerous. You are trying to predict a moving target from a single photograph. And people move. They learn, they adapt, they recover, they build, they fail. They try again. Sometimes they transform completely. History is filled with people whose early lives gave little indication of what they would eventually become. But we need to be careful here. Success stories are often rewritten after success arrives. Once someone becomes famous, every childhood difficulty becomes a prophecy. Every rejection becomes destiny. Every failure becomes evidence that greatness was inevitable. It was not. For every famous person who overcame rejection, millions of other people experienced rejection without becoming famous. History remembers survivors. It forgets enormous numbers of people whose stories ended differently. So the lesson is not, every person you bully will become powerful. The lesson is more intelligent. You cannot know which person will. And even if they never become famous, wealthy, or powerful, humiliating them was still unnecessary. Respect should not depend on whether someone might become useful later. But strategically, underestimating people remains foolish, because human potential is difficult to measure early. Consider Abraham Lincoln. Today, Lincoln's image is carved into monuments. His face appears on American currency. His speeches are studied around the world. He is remembered as the president who led the United States through the Civil War and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But history looks different when viewed forward rather than backward. Lincoln did not begin life looking like a monument. He was born in 1809 into modest circumstances on the American frontier. His formal schooling was limited. Much of his education was self-directed. He worked different jobs. He experienced business difficulties. He entered politics. He won some contests and lost others. His political career contained significant defeats. He lost a congressional nomination. He lost a Senate race. He faced criticism. He experienced profound personal grief. There were many moments when an observer could have looked at Lincoln and concluded, this man will never become historically important. Then circumstances changed. The political environment changed. Lincoln changed. Opportunity and preparation eventually met. In 1860, he was elected president. Within months, the United States entered the greatest constitutional and military crisis in its history. The man who had experienced repeated setbacks now carried responsibility for preserving the Union. His earlier struggles did not guarantee success, but they became part of the person who eventually faced that crisis. This is the first lesson of underestimation. Failure is information. It is not always identity. A person can fail at something without being a failure. That distinction sounds simple, but many people never learn it. They fail once and conclude, I cannot do this. Someone rejects them and they conclude, I have no value. A business collapses and they conclude, I am not an entrepreneur. A relationship ends and they conclude, nobody will ever love me. A bully attacks them and they conclude, I am weak. But an event and an identity are not the same thing. You can lose without becoming a loser. You can be rejected without becoming worthless. You can be inexperienced without being incapable. You can be powerless today without remaining powerless forever. This is where the philosophy of Epictetus becomes useful. Epictetus began life under conditions of slavery in the Roman world. He later became one of the most influential Stoic philosophers. His philosophy centered on a distinction that remains powerful today. Some things are within our control, others are not. You cannot completely control what other people think of you. You cannot control every opportunity. You cannot control where you were born. You cannot control every injustice. You cannot control whether people underestimate you. But you can influence what you do next, your habits, your discipline, your response, your learning, your character. This sounds less dramatic than revenge, but it is far more powerful, because revenge makes another person the center of your life. Self-development returns the center to you. Imagine someone tells you, you will never succeed. There are two ways they can control you. The obvious way is if you believe them and quit. But there is another more subtle form of control. You become obsessed with proving them wrong. Every achievement becomes a message to them. Every purchase, every promotion, every relationship, every success. Look at me now. Do you regret what you said? At first, this feels like victory, but think carefully. Who is still determining your direction? The bully. They insulted you 10 years ago, and you are still performing for them. That is not complete freedom. The strongest response eventually becomes, your opinion is no longer relevant to the direction of my life. That is liberation. This is why the title of this chapter, The Revenge of the Underestimated, needs clarification. The best revenge is not destruction. It is transformation. Not because transformation hurts your enemies, but because transformation reduces their importance. You become so occupied with building your own life that the old humiliation loses its power. And sometimes this transformation begins during periods that look like failure. Consider Steve Jobs. In the 1970s, Jobs helped build Apple alongside Steve Wozniak and others. The company grew rapidly. Jobs became closely identified with its rise. Then internal conflict developed. In 1985, he left Apple. Imagine that moment without knowing what comes next. You helped create the company. Your identity is tied to it. Then you are outside. If the story ended there, people might describe Jobs very differently today. But the story continued. Jobs founded Next. The company never became the mass-market computer success he initially hoped for. But its technology became important. Jobs also acquired the computer graphics division that became Pixar. Pixar eventually transformed computer animation and became enormously successful. Meanwhile, Apple struggled. In 1997, Apple acquired Nexty. Jobs returned to the company he had left more than a decade earlier. Eventually, he again became its leader. Under his leadership, Apple introduced products that transformed multiple industries. The iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. Again, we should not turn this into mythology. Jobs was a complicated leader. He could be extraordinarily demanding. Accounts of his management include both visionary brilliance and difficult interpersonal behavior. That complexity matters. Successful people are not automatically good people, and being underestimated does not automatically produce wisdom. But his career demonstrates something central to our argument. A moment that looks like the end may become an intermediate chapter. You cannot judge the entire trajectory from the lowest point. This is true far beyond famous individuals. Perhaps the most important examples will never appear in history books. The student who struggles at 16 and becomes excellent at 30. The immigrant who arrives with little and slowly builds stability. The employee who is overlooked, learns new skills, and eventually creates a company. The person who leaves a destructive relationship and rebuilds their confidence. The child from a difficult household who decides, this pattern ends with me. These transformations may never become documentaries, but they are enormous to the people living them, because greatness does not always mean becoming famous. Sometimes greatness means becoming free, free from dependence, free from destructive habits, free from the need for approval, free from the environment that once convinced you that you were small. This is why quiet development matters. The world has a strange relationship with visible success. People respect outcomes. They often ignore processes. When someone becomes wealthy, everyone wants to know them. When they are building, nobody cares. When the athlete wins, everyone celebrates. During training, nobody watches. When the author becomes famous, people quote the book. During years of rejection, the manuscript sits unnoticed. This creates an illusion that success happens suddenly. It usually does not. There are sudden breakthroughs. But many breakthroughs rest on long periods of invisible preparation. Think about a tree. You look at it after 20 years and see strength, but the tree did not become strong on the day you noticed it. Growth occurred gradually, season after season. Rain, heat, wind, damage, repair, root expansion. The visible structure is the accumulated result of thousands of invisible processes. Human development is similar. Confidence is often accumulated evidence. You do something difficult. You survive. You do something else. You improve. You fail. You recover. Slowly you build a private record that says, I can handle things. That is real confidence, not shouting, not pretending. Evidence. This is why the person being bullied can change dramatically once they begin accumulating evidence of competence. They learn a skill. Evidence. They earn their own money. Evidence. They establish a boundary. Evidence they survive rejection. Evidence they speak up once. Evidence they leave a destructive environment. Evidence. Each experience changes the story they tell themselves. The bully's voice says, you are weak. Reality begins answering, no, I was inexperienced. There is a difference. And once that distinction becomes clear, the psychological relationship can change. The victim no longer needs the bully to change. This is important. Many people remain trapped because they believe freedom requires an apology. One day they will understand what they did. One day they will admit they were wrong. One day they will regret it. Maybe, maybe not. Some people never apologize. Some rewrite history. Some justify everything. Some forget the pain they caused. If your healing requires their understanding, they still control part of your future. Sometimes you have to move forward without the apology. Not because what happened was acceptable, because your life is too valuable to remain suspended while waiting for someone else to develop self-awareness. This is where resentment can be converted into something more useful. Energy. The energy that once asked, why did they do this to me, can become, what can I build now? The energy that said, I will show them, can become, I will improve myself. The energy that wanted revenge can become discipline. This is not easy. Pain does not automatically become wisdom. It can become bitterness. It can become obsession. It can become cruelty. That transformation requires conscious effort. And this brings us to Jack Ma. Before becoming associated with Alibaba, Jack Ma's story included numerous setbacks and rejections. He has publicly discussed struggling academically in some areas, failing entrance examinations before eventually succeeding, and being rejected from various jobs. His later success turned these experiences into part of a famous entrepreneurial narrative. But again, the important lesson is not that rejection magically creates billionaires. It is that rejection contains limited information. A company rejecting you knows whether they want you for that position at that moment. They do not know your entire future. A school examination measures performance under particular conditions. It does not measure every dimension of human potential. A failed business tells you something about that business. It does not necessarily determine whether you can ever succeed in business. We make terrible psychological mistakes when we convert specific outcomes into universal identities. Rejected here becomes rejected everywhere. Failed today becomes failure forever. Weak in this environment becomes weak in every environment. That is exactly the mental mistake the bully makes about the victim. They see vulnerability and assume permanence. But environments matter. The quiet person in one group may become charismatic in another. The average student under one teaching system may thrive under another. The employee who appears mediocre under a terrible manager may become excellent under good leadership. The person who lacks confidence around abusive people may become completely different once surrounded by respect. Human behavior is partly personal and partly environmental. Change the environment, and sometimes you meet a different person. This is why leaving can be transformational. People sometimes spend years trying to prove themselves in places committed to misunderstanding them. They think strength means staying. Sometimes strength means recognizing, this environment is not where I will grow. The seed may not be defective. The soil may be wrong. That metaphor should not become an excuse. Sometimes the problem really is you. Sometimes you need discipline. Sometimes criticism is accurate. Sometimes failure reflects poor preparation. Sometimes the people telling you to improve are doing you a favor. Self-respect does not mean believing every negative judgment is false. It means evaluating criticism without allowing criticism to define your entire identity. Ask, is this true? What can I learn? What needs to change? What should I ignore? That is stronger than either extreme. One extreme believes every insult. The other rejects every criticism. Maturity learns to separate useful information from unnecessary humiliation. This is also why the underestimated person must resist arrogance when success arrives. There is a seductive moment after proving people wrong. You remember everyone who doubted you. Now you have money, influence, status, confidence, and a temptation appears. Now it is my turn. Now I will make them feel small. Now I will treat others the way they treated me. This is where the story can become tragic. Because if your response to being bullied is becoming a better bully, the bully still won. They reproduced themselves through you. Their behavior entered your character. You escaped their control but adopted their philosophy. Power belongs to whoever can dominate. Weak people deserve humiliation. Respect flows only upward. Now you have become what you once hated. That is not transformation. That is succession. Real transformation breaks the cycle. You remember what powerlessness felt like. So when power arrives, you use it differently. You remember being the beginner. So you teach beginners without humiliating them. You remember needing opportunity. So when possible, you create opportunity. You remember what it felt like to have no voice. So you listen when someone beneath you speaks. This is how pain becomes wisdom, not when it makes you harder, when it makes you more conscious. There is an important distinction between softness and compassion. Compassion does not mean allowing incompetence. A good leader can be demanding. A good teacher can have high standards. A strong parent can enforce boundaries. A disciplined organization can remove people who repeatedly fail to meet expectations. The difference is whether strength serves improvement or ego. You can tell someone, this is not good enough, without saying, you are nothing. You can win without humiliating. You can become powerful without becoming cruel. And perhaps that is the ultimate revenge of the underestimated. Not that the person who once stood below everyone eventually gets the chance to stand on their necks, but that they rise and refuse to repeat the behavior. They become evidence that strength and cruelty are not the same thing. They become evidence that pain does not have to reproduce itself. They become evidence that your beginning does not have to determine your ending. So if you are currently being underestimated, remember this. Do not waste all your energy announcing what you will become. Build, learn, train, save, read, practice, ask questions, develop useful relationships. Take criticism seriously without allowing insults to define you. Become harder to control because you have more options. Become harder to deceive because you understand more. Become harder to intimidate because you have survived difficulty. And become less interested in proving yourself to people who have already decided not to see you clearly. Your life is larger than their opinion, and if you are currently powerful, remember the opposite lesson. Be careful who you dismiss. Be careful who you humiliate. Be careful when you laugh at someone's beginning. You are looking at one frame from a very long film. You do not know what happens next. The person cleaning the office may be studying at night. The employee you overlook may be developing skills you do not possess. The student who struggles today may simply not have discovered where their ability lies. The competitor you mock may be learning from every mistake. The person who appears broken may be rebuilding privately. You do not know. And because you do not know, humility is intelligent. Every expert was once inexperienced. Every powerful person was once dependent on someone. Every wealthy person was once separated from their wealth by time and circumstance. Every old person was once young. Every leader was once unknown. And every human being is temporary. That alone should make arrogance difficult, because today's hierarchy is not permanent. The person above can fall. The person below can rise. And sometimes the greatest reversal happens when someone who once experienced powerlessness finally gains power. That moment reveals whether their suffering taught them wisdom or merely taught them to wait for their turn. Because gaining power is not the end of the test. It is the beginning of another one. The question changes. It is no longer, what will you do when people treat you badly? Now it becomes, what will you do when you finally have the power to treat others however you want? That is where we go next, because sometimes the victim escapes the bully, only to become one. Chapter 6, Power Creates Tests. There is a dangerous assumption hidden inside many stories about suffering. We assume that the person who experiences injustice will automatically become more just, that the person who experiences cruelty will automatically become kinder, that the person who knows what powerlessness feels like will use power responsibly when their turn finally comes. History tells us otherwise. Pain can produce empathy, but pain can also produce resentment. Powerlessness can create humility, but it can also create a hunger for domination. And sometimes the person who spends years condemning the behavior of the powerful discovers, after gaining power, that they were not opposed to domination itself. They were opposed to being the person dominated. That distinction changes everything. Imagine two children growing up under a harsh father. Both experience the same anger, the same humiliation, the same fear. Years later, both become parents. The first remembers what childhood felt like and decides, my children will not experience what I experienced. The second remembers the same childhood and thinks, I survived it. They should survive it too. Same pain, different lesson. One transforms suffering into compassion. The other transforms suffering into tradition. This is how destructive patterns survive generations. People do not always repeat behavior because they believe it is good. Sometimes they repeat it because it is familiar. This is how I was raised. This is how my boss treated me. This is how beginners are supposed to suffer. This is how men are supposed to behave. This is how leadership works. This is how power works. And without realizing it, the person who once hated the system becomes one of its guardians. There is a phrase sometimes used to describe this pattern: identification with the aggressor. The idea, in broad psychological terms, is that people exposed to threatening power can sometimes begin adopting aspects of the behavior, attitudes, or worldview of those who dominated them. The powerless person learns a lesson. Not, cruelty is wrong, but cruelty belongs to whoever is stronger, so their goal becomes strength, not to eliminate the system, to change positions within it. This is one of the oldest tragedies in human history. The slave dreams of freedom. Then sometimes when freedom arrives, dreams of having slaves. The humiliated employee becomes a manager, then humiliates junior employees. The bullied student becomes older, then finds someone younger. The oppressed political movement gains authority, then discovers reasons to silence its own opponents. The names change. The structure survives. This is why changing who holds power is not enough. You must also change the philosophy governing power. Otherwise, revolution becomes rotation. One group descends, another rises, and the machinery of domination continues operating. The French Revolution offers one of history's most dramatic examples of how liberation and violence can become entangled. France in the late 18th century was experiencing enormous political, social, and financial pressures. The monarchy faced a severe fiscal crisis. The social order preserved privileges for particular estates. Food prices and economic hardship intensified public frustration. Political demands grew. Then, in 1789, revolution erupted. The language was extraordinary. Liberty, equality, citizenship, rights, old structures of privilege were attacked. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed sweeping principles about liberty and equality before the law. It appeared that an old system of hierarchy was being replaced by a new political order. But revolutions rarely move in straight lines. France entered war. Political factions struggled for control. Fear of counter-revolution intensified. The monarchy fell. Louis XVI was executed. And eventually the revolution entered the period remembered as the Reign of Terror. Thousands of people were executed. The guillotine became one of the defining symbols of the period. Among the most influential revolutionary figures was Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre had spoken passionately about republican virtue and political equality, but revolutionary government increasingly justified extraordinary coercion in the name of protecting the revolution. The logic became dangerous. We are defending freedom. Our enemies threaten freedom. Therefore, extraordinary measures against our enemies are justified. This is one of the most seductive arguments in politics, because almost any cruelty can be presented as temporary when people believe they are protecting something sacred. Just until the emergency ends, just until the enemies are defeated, just until stability returns. But emergency power develops its own appetite. The instrument created to destroy enemies eventually needs more enemies. And then something almost inevitable happened. The revolution consumed some of its own architects. Robespierre himself was arrested and executed in 1794. The man associated with revolutionary terror eventually faced the same machinery. History has repeated variations of this pattern many times. A movement begins with legitimate grievances. The movement gains strength. It develops institutions. Then it faces opposition. The temptation appears. We suffered. Therefore our actions are justified. We were victims. Therefore we cannot become oppressors. That second statement is especially dangerous. Victimhood does not grant permanent moral immunity. A person can be wronged and later do wrong. A group can experience injustice and later commit injustice. A painful history can explain behavior without automatically justifying every future action. This is essential if cycles of retaliation are ever going to end, because everyone can find an old wound. Every family has grievances. Every nation has historical injuries. Every ethnic group has memories. Every religion has martyrs. Every political movement has stories of betrayal. If suffering automatically creates permission for revenge, humanity will never run out of reasons to hurt one another. There is always an older injustice, always another grave, always another humiliation, always another generation willing to say, "Now it is our turn." This is why justice and revenge must be separated. They can feel similar, both respond to wrongdoing, but their objectives are different. Justice asks, what must be done to correct the wrong, protect people, establish accountability, and restore order? Revenge asks, how can I make them feel what I felt? Justice looks toward a functioning future. Revenge remains emotionally attached to the past. This does not mean justice is gentle. Justice can impose serious consequences. People who commit crimes may need punishment. People who abuse authority may need removal. Institutions that create injustice may need reform or replacement. Forgiveness does not require pretending nothing happened. Reconciliation does not mean eliminating accountability. The distinction is purpose. Are we trying to stop the wrong? Or are we trying to enjoy the suffering of the person who caused it? That question becomes especially important when power changes hands. Because revenge feels different when you finally have the ability to carry it out. While powerless, you can imagine yourself as merciful. You have no choice. You cannot retaliate anyway. But when you finally possess authority, when you have the money, the votes, the army, the position, the information, the social influence, then restraint becomes real. Power creates the test. This is why the story of Nelson Mandela remains relevant. Mandela spent 27 years imprisoned under apartheid. When he was released in 1990, South Africa faced an extraordinarily dangerous transition. The country contained deep racial divisions. Political violence was occurring. Different organizations and communities feared what the future would bring. White South Africans feared retaliation and dispossession. Black South Africans carried generations of legitimate anger over dispossession, discrimination, political exclusion, violence, and humiliation. The ingredients for revenge were everywhere. Mandela could not erase those emotions, nor did reconciliation magically solve them. But he repeatedly emphasized building a shared political future rather than treating democratic transition as permission for collective retaliation. One of the most famous symbolic moments came during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. Rugby had long been strongly associated with white Afrikaner identity. Many black South Africans viewed the Springbok emblem as connected to apartheid. It would have been politically understandable for a new government to discard the symbol. Instead, Mandela publicly embraced the national rugby team. When South Africa reached the final, Mandela appeared wearing the Springbok jersey associated with Captain Francois Pienaar. The image became iconic. A black president who had spent decades imprisoned by an apartheid government stood wearing a symbol many of his supporters had once rejected. This was not merely about sport. It was political communication. The message was, the new South Africa will not be built simply by reversing who is humiliated. We need a country both sides can inhabit. Again, reality was far more complicated than the symbolism. South Africa continued to struggle with inequality, crime, economic exclusion, racial tension, and the unfinished consequences of apartheid. Reconciliation did not erase structural problems. But Mandela's approach demonstrated something rare: the ability to gain power without using every opportunity to humiliate former opponents. That is a form of strength, because revenge is emotionally easy to understand. Restraint is harder. The person who hurt you stands in front of you. Now you have the advantage. Everything inside you says, make them feel it. This is where character enters. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about responding to wrongdoing without becoming corrupted by it. The Stoic challenge was not to pretend that bad behavior did not exist. It was to prevent another person's behavior from determining your own character. Someone behaves dishonestly. You do not therefore need to become dishonest. Someone behaves cruelly. You do not therefore need to become cruel. Someone loses self-control. You do not need to surrender yours. This is one of the deepest forms of independence. Your enemy does not get to choose what kind of person you become. Think about that carefully. If someone humiliates you and your response is to become obsessed with humiliating others, they have influenced your character. If someone betrays you and you decide never to trust anyone again, their action has entered every future relationship. If someone treats you cruelly and you adopt cruelty as your philosophy, part of them now lives through you. That is not victory. Freedom requires something harder. You learn from what happened, without becoming a copy of what happened. This principle applies strongly to parenting. A person grows up with a parent who uses fear. They remember the shouting, the threats, the humiliation. Then they have children. One day their child misbehaves, anger rises, and suddenly words come out of their mouth that sound exactly like their parent. For a moment, time collapses. They have become the voice they once feared. This is where generational patterns either continue or break. Breaking them requires awareness. You must notice the pattern before you can interrupt it. This is why self-examination matters. Ask, which behaviors did I learn simply because I was exposed to them repeatedly? Which beliefs about power came from people who hurt me? Which habits am I carrying forward without choosing them? The same examination applies to workplaces. A young employee joins an organization. Senior staff treat junior employees badly. They say, we all went through this. Years later, the young employee becomes senior. Now a new employee arrives. What happens? The easiest response is repetition. I suffered, you suffer. This is sometimes disguised as fairness, but suffering is not made fair by distributing it. If a system was bad when it hurt you, becoming the administrator of the same system does not make it good. Perhaps the better response is, I learned under unnecessary difficulty. You will learn under high standards without unnecessary humiliation. That is progress. Standards remain. Cruelty disappears. This distinction is important because breaking cycles does not mean lowering expectations. A person can be compassionate and demanding. A military commander can demand discipline without sadism. A coach can push athletes without destroying their dignity. A parent can enforce rules without humiliation. A manager can fire someone who consistently fails without enjoying the person's distress. The absence of cruelty is not the absence of strength. It is strength under control. This brings us to a controversial psychological case often mentioned in discussions about power, the Stanford Prison Experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo and colleagues conducted a simulation at Stanford University in which college students were assigned roles as prisoners and guards in a mock prison. The study became famous for claims about how quickly ordinary people could adopt abusive behavior when placed into powerful roles. For decades, the experiment was used as dramatic evidence that situations can transform behavior. But later researchers and journalists raised substantial criticisms. Questions were raised about methodology, researcher influence, instructions given to participants, interpretation of behavior, and whether the study justified the sweeping conclusions often drawn from it. This matters. We should not use questionable science merely because it tells a dramatic story. But the controversy itself teaches something useful. Human behavior emerges from an interaction between personality, incentives, institutions, expectations, culture, and situation. Power does not mechanically transform every good person into a monster. That would be too simple. But power changes the environment in which character operates. It removes constraints. It increases options. It can reduce consequences. And therefore it reveals choices that powerlessness may have hidden. A person with no authority cannot demonstrate how they would behave with authority. Give them authority. Now we learn something. This is why power is a test, money is a test, fame is a test, leadership is a test, physical strength is a test, knowledge is a test, even beauty can be a test. Every advantage asks the same question. What will you do now that you possess something other people want or need? Will you use it to build? Will you use it to protect? Will you use it to create? Or will you use it to remind everyone that you have it? This is where insecurity and power become especially dangerous together. An insecure person without power may be irritating. An insecure person with enormous power can become destructive, because now personal wounds have institutional tools. The manager's insecurity can affect hundreds of employees. The parent's insecurity can shape children. The political leader's insecurity can affect millions. The business owner's insecurity can determine organizational culture. Power amplifies consequences. That is why the higher you rise, the more important self-awareness becomes. At the bottom, your uncontrolled ego may destroy your afternoon. At the top, it can destroy organizations, sometimes countries. This is why great leadership requires something that appears almost contradictory. Confidence and humility. Confidence to make decisions. Humility to know you can be wrong. Confidence to exercise authority. Humility to listen to people without authority. Confidence to act. Humility to change direction when evidence changes. The bully has confidence without humility, or at least the performance of confidence. That combination eventually creates blindness. Because if everyone beneath you is afraid to challenge you, you become isolated from correction. You begin hearing applause where there should be warnings. This is where power starts creating its own downfall. The leader believes, nobody disagrees with me, but perhaps everyone is afraid. The manager believes, my team supports the decision. Perhaps nobody wants to become the next person publicly humiliated. The parent believes, my children respect me. Perhaps they are simply waiting until adulthood. The bully believes, everyone knows I am strong. Perhaps everyone is simply waiting for someone else to challenge them first. Fear creates silence, and silence can deceive the powerful. This is why people who gain power after being bullied must be especially careful. You know what powerlessness feels like. That knowledge can become wisdom, or it can become justification. You can say, because I suffered, I will protect others. Or, because I suffered, I have earned the right to make others suffer. One path breaks the cycle. The other merely changes the name of the bully. So, when success finally arrives, when you become the manager, when you become the parent, when you become wealthy, when people finally listen, when the person who once mocked you suddenly wants your attention, remember who you were. When nobody cared, remember what unnecessary humiliation felt like. Remember how valuable one respectful person could be. Remember the difference between the teacher who corrected you and the person who enjoyed embarrassing you. Then make a decision. The pain stops here. Not the standards, not accountability, not discipline, the unnecessary cruelty. It stops here. That may be one of the greatest victories available to a human being. Not defeating the person who hurt you, preventing their behavior from reproducing itself through you. Because eventually, every victim who gains power faces the same question. Will you build the world you wished existed when you were weak? Or will you recreate the world that wounded you because now you finally get to stand on top? History is filled with both answers, and understanding the difference takes us into the minds of some of history's most famous thinkers about conflict and power. Sun Tzu understood that unnecessary battles create unnecessary costs. Machiavelli understood that fear can be useful, but hatred can become politically dangerous. And centuries later, writers studying power would return repeatedly to the same strategic problem. How do you become strong without surrounding yourself with enemies? That is where we go next. Chapter 7, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and the Strategy of Respect. There is a primitive understanding of power, and there is a strategic understanding of power. The primitive understanding says, if I am stronger than you, I should demonstrate it. If you challenge me, I should crush you. If you disrespect me, I should humiliate you. If I can dominate you, I should, because domination proves strength. But the strategist asks a different question. What does this victory cost? That question changes everything. Because not every person you can defeat should become your enemy. Not every insult deserves retaliation. Not every disagreement requires humiliation. And not every victory improves your position. Sometimes you win the confrontation and lose something far more valuable: a relationship, an employee, a customer, an ally, a reputation, a family member, an opportunity. Sometimes you win today and quietly manufacture tomorrow's enemy. This is where Sun Tzu enters our story. The art of war emerged from the ancient Chinese tradition of military strategy more than 2,000 years ago. Its world was different from ours. States fought for territory. Armies marched across landscapes. Commanders faced questions of logistics, intelligence, deception, terrain, morale, and survival. Yet underneath the military context lies a principle that remains relevant. Conflict is expensive. Even victory is expensive. A battle can be won while weakening the army that wins it. A territory can be captured while exhausting the state that captures it. An enemy can be defeated while creating conditions for another enemy to rise. Therefore, the objective of strategy is not simply fighting well. It is achieving objectives efficiently. This is why Sun Tzu places such importance on calculation. Know the terrain. Know the enemy. Know yourself. Understand conditions. Avoid fighting merely because emotion demands it. The amateur wants the dramatic battle. The strategist wants the useful outcome. This distinction applies directly to bullying. The bully loves visible victories. They want everyone to see who dominates. The strategist cares about consequences that may not be visible today. Suppose you are a manager. An employee makes a mistake during an important meeting. You have two options. You can correct the mistake firmly and privately, or you can humiliate the employee in front of everyone. The second option may feel more powerful. The room becomes silent. Nobody challenges you. The employee looks embarrassed. For 10 seconds, you appear completely dominant. Victory. But what happens strategically? The employee may now fear you. Other employees may become afraid of making mistakes. People may stop taking intelligent risks. They may hide problems. They may avoid telling you bad news. The employee you embarrassed may begin looking for another job. And everyone watching learns something. If I make a mistake, this person may humiliate me publicly. You won 10 seconds of dominance, and perhaps purchased years of distrust. Was that strength or poor strategy? This is the difference between visible power and durable power. Visible power says, look what I can make people do. Durable power asks, what happens when I am not watching? Fear can make someone obey while you are present. Respect can influence behavior when you are absent. That difference is enormous. A feared manager walks into the room and everyone works. The manager leaves and everyone relaxes. A respected leader leaves the room and standards remain because people believe in the mission, the culture, or their own responsibility. One system requires constant surveillance. The other develops internal commitment. Which one is stronger? This brings us to Niccolò Machiavelli. Few political thinkers have been misunderstood as dramatically. His name itself became an adjective: Machiavellian, manipulative, deceptive, ruthless. And there is certainly harsh realism in his writing. Machiavelli lived during a violent and unstable period of Italian politics. City-states competed, foreign powers intervened, alliances shifted, rulers rose and fell. Political weakness could be catastrophic. His famous work, The Prince, examined how rulers acquire and preserve political power under dangerous conditions. One of its most famous discussions asks whether it is better for a ruler to be loved or feared. Machiavelli's answer is often repeated in simplified form. It is safer to be feared than loved. And many people stop reading there. But the qualification matters enormously. A ruler should avoid being hated. Fear and hatred are not identical. Fear says, there will be consequences if I challenge you. Hatred says, I want to see you fall. That difference should terrify anyone who relies heavily on coercion. Because a person who fears you may obey. A person who hates you may obey while waiting. Waiting for what? A mistake, a scandal, a competitor, a change in leadership, a financial crisis, an illness, a legal problem, a moment when your protection disappears. The bully believes obedience means victory. The strategist asks what emotion exists underneath the obedience. That is a much better question. Why are these people following me? Because they trust me. Because they respect my competence. Because our interests are aligned. Because they believe in the mission. Or because they fear punishment. If fear is the only answer, your power is more fragile than it appears, because you must remain capable of punishment forever. The moment your power weakens, the relationship changes. This is one reason humiliation is strategically dangerous. Consequences can be forgotten. Humiliation is often remembered. People can accept losing. They struggle to forget being degraded. There is a difference between defeating an opponent and making an opponent feel that their dignity has been attacked. The first may end a conflict. The second may give the conflict emotional life. History contains countless examples of defeated groups carrying memories across generations. Stories become identity. Children inherit grievances they never personally experienced. Old humiliations become political symbols. The original participants die. The memory remains. This does not mean every historical grievance is accurate or that inherited resentment is always justified. Collective memory can exaggerate, simplify, mythologize, and manipulate. But strategically, the mechanism matters. Humiliation can outlive the person who delivered it. This is why intelligent victors think carefully about what happens after victory. You defeated the opponent. Now what? Do you need cooperation? Do you need stability? Do you need information? Do you need trade? Do you need employees? Do you need the defeated population to participate in the new system? If yes, humiliation may undermine your own objective. This principle became dramatically visible after the First World War. The war devastated Europe. Millions were dead. Empires collapsed. Economies were damaged. Political systems were shaken. Then came the peace settlement. The Treaty of Versailles imposed significant obligations and territorial changes on Germany, including reparations and the famous war guilt clause. Historians continue debating exactly how much responsibility the treaty itself should bear for later developments. The rise of Nazism cannot be explained by one treaty. The Great Depression mattered. Political violence mattered, institutional weakness mattered, nationalism mattered, anti-Semitism mattered, the legacy of war mattered, the choices of individuals mattered. History becomes dangerous when complex disasters are reduced to a single cause. But there is broad recognition that resentment over the post-war settlement became politically useful to German nationalists. Adolf Hitler exploited grievances surrounding defeat, humiliation, territorial loss, and national decline. This is one of the darker strategic lessons of history. Humiliation can become political fuel. Again, this does not excuse what followed. Nothing about German resentment justifies Nazi aggression or genocide. Explanation is not justification. But if we want to understand power, we must understand how resentment is weaponized. A humiliated population becomes vulnerable to leaders who promise restoration. A humiliated individual can become vulnerable to anyone who promises revenge. This is why wise leadership is careful with humiliation. You do not know who will eventually organize the resentment you create. This principle applies on a much smaller scale too. Imagine a family. One sibling becomes successful. They constantly mock another sibling who is struggling. Every gathering becomes a performance. Look at my house, my career, my children, my money. What have you achieved? Perhaps everyone laughs. Perhaps the struggling sibling says nothing. Years pass, then circumstances change. Maybe the successful sibling experiences difficulty. Maybe the struggling sibling finally succeeds. What kind of relationship exists now? The problem was never the difference in success. The problem was the humiliation attached to it. You can be ahead without making someone else feel worthless. This is where Robert Greene's writing about power becomes relevant. Greene's work, especially the 48 Laws of Power, draws from historical examples of courts, rulers, generals, artists, politicians, and strategists. His work is not a moral guide in the conventional sense. It is largely observational. How do people pursue influence? How do egos react? How does envy operate? How do reputations rise and collapse? One recurring lesson across the history of power is the danger of unnecessarily injuring people's pride. Human beings are not purely rational. We care about status, recognition, dignity, and ego. A person may accept losing money more easily than public humiliation. A person may forgive disagreement more easily than contempt. This means intelligent social behavior requires understanding not only what people materially lose, but what they believe the loss says about them. Sometimes the smartest victory allows the other person to preserve dignity. This does not mean pretending they won. It means not adding unnecessary humiliation to necessary defeat. A good negotiator understands this. A good leader understands this. A good parent understands this. A good diplomat understands this. You may need the relationship tomorrow. Leave a door. The bully does the opposite. They want total victory. Not only must I win, you must know that you lost. Everyone must know that you lost, and you must feel small while losing. That final part is often where strategic stupidity begins, because now the opponent's objective changes. Before, perhaps they wanted a reasonable outcome, now they want to restore dignity. And people will sometimes pay enormous costs to restore dignity. This is where arrogance becomes dangerous. Success creates evidence. You win once, then again, then again. The mind begins creating a story. I win because I am special, not because conditions favored me, not because I had good information, not because others helped, not because luck played a role, not because my opponent made mistakes, because I am simply superior. That story is intoxicating, and once you believe it, you stop learning. Napoleon Bonaparte illustrates the danger. Napoleon was unquestionably an extraordinary military commander. He rose during the upheaval of the French Revolution and eventually became emperor. His campaigns transformed Europe. He defeated coalitions of powerful states. His operational speed, organization, use of artillery, corps structure, and ability to concentrate forces helped create remarkable victories. Success followed success, and with success came expanding ambition. Then came Russia. In 1812, Napoleon invaded the Russian Empire with an enormous multinational army. The campaign became catastrophic. Russian forces withdrew, rather than offering Napoleon the decisive battle he wanted. Supply lines stretched, disease spread, food became difficult to obtain. The Russians used scorched earth tactics in many areas. Moscow was occupied but did not produce the political settlement Napoleon expected. Then came retreat. Cold intensified the disaster, though enormous losses had already occurred before the harshest winter conditions. The Grande Armée was devastated. Napoleon did not suddenly become stupid in 1812. That is the important point. Brilliant people can make terrible decisions. Experience does not immunize you against arrogance. Sometimes experience creates arrogance. Past success becomes the evidence used to dismiss new risks. I have survived before. I have won before, therefore I will win again. This is the bully's psychological trap. They bullied one person. Nothing happened, another. Nothing happened, another. Still nothing. Eventually they stopped calculating risk. They believe the absence of previous consequences guarantees the absence of future consequences. But probability does not work that way. Every new person is different. Every situation is different. Every environment is different. One day, the bully chooses the wrong target, not necessarily someone physically stronger, perhaps someone with evidence, someone with institutional support, someone with legal knowledge, someone with social influence, someone who has finally decided to establish boundaries. Or perhaps the target remains quiet while everyone else begins recognizing the pattern. The bully believes the confrontation is still between two people. It is not. Reputation has entered the conflict, and reputation is another form of power. This is why intelligent people treat those beneath them carefully. Not because every person might become dangerous. Because unnecessary cruelty provides little benefit and creates unpredictable costs. That is strategy. Imagine two business owners. Both are successful. The first treats suppliers, junior employees, customers, and competitors with basic dignity. They negotiate aggressively. They protect their interests. They sometimes say no. They sometimes fire people. They sometimes sue. They are not weak, but they avoid unnecessary humiliation. The second owner enjoys demonstrating superiority. They delay payments because they can, humiliate employees, mock small competitors, treat suppliers as disposable. What happens over 20 years? The first person may accumulate something invisible, goodwill. People take their calls. Former employees recommend them. Suppliers give warnings. Competitors can still negotiate with them. The second person accumulates something else, people waiting for an alternative. That difference may remain invisible during good times. Then crisis arrives, and crisis reveals the value of relationships. Suddenly you need patience from suppliers. You need employees to work harder. You need former colleagues to answer. You need customers to trust you. You need people to give you the benefit of the doubt. Reputation becomes capital. This is why respect is not merely moral decoration. It has strategic value. But there is an even deeper reason to avoid bullying. You should not need the possibility of future consequences to behave decently. If your only reason for respecting someone is that they might become powerful later, you have learned strategy but missed character. The cleaner deserves dignity, even if they remain a cleaner forever. The junior employee deserves dignity, even if they never become a CEO. The poor person deserves dignity even if they never become rich. The child deserves dignity before they can offer you anything. Respect is not an investment scheme where you treat people well in case they become useful. That would simply be sophisticated selfishness. Character means recognizing humanity even when there is no strategic reward. But morality and strategy happen to converge here. Unnecessary cruelty is both ethically questionable and strategically expensive. That is why the strongest person in the room often has the least need to demonstrate strength. They know what they can do. They do not need every interaction to become evidence. This is what emotional security looks like. You can allow someone else to shine without feeling diminished. You can admit a mistake without feeling destroyed. You can apologize without believing you have become weak. You can walk away from a pointless argument without needing the last word. You can let an insult pass because your identity does not depend on winning every exchange. This is a higher form of power, self-command. And it may be the form of power that Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, the Stoics, and many later thinkers understood from different directions. External power without internal discipline is unstable. The person who must respond to every provocation can be manipulated. The person who must dominate every room becomes predictable. The person who cannot tolerate criticism becomes easy to flatter. The person who cannot accept losing becomes vulnerable to escalation. And the person who needs everyone to fear them eventually creates a world filled with people waiting for their weakness. So build power. There is nothing noble about helplessness. Develop competence, build resources, protect yourself, learn how the world works, become capable of saying no. But understand what power is for. Power should increase your freedom, not increase your need to prove yourself. If gaining money makes you more insecure, something went wrong. If gaining authority makes you more cruel, something went wrong. If becoming stronger makes you obsessed with weaker people, something went wrong. The purpose of strength is not to spend your life searching for people you can defeat. It is to become difficult to control while remaining capable of controlling yourself. That is strategic maturity. Sun Tzu teaches us to calculate the cost of conflict. Machiavelli warns us about the political danger of hatred. History teaches us that humiliation can outlive victory. And ordinary life teaches the same lesson every day. Do not create enemies for entertainment. Do not turn correction into humiliation. Do not mistake fear for loyalty. Do not destroy tomorrow's relationship for today's ego. And never assume that because someone cannot respond now, they will never have options. Because power changes, circumstances change, reputations change, allies change, fortunes change, and eventually every person who builds their identity around dominating others encounters the same terrifying possibility. What happens when the power disappears? That is where we go next, because bullies often believe consequences do not exist. What they fail to understand is that consequences are frequently delayed, and delayed consequences are especially dangerous, because they arrive after arrogance has convinced you that you are untouchable. Chapter 8. When bullies meet consequences. Consequences have a timing problem. They do not always arrive when the mistake is made. Sometimes they arrive immediately. Touch fire. You are burned. Make a reckless financial decision. Lose money. Break a law in front of the police. Face consequences. Cause and effect are obvious. But many of life's most important consequences are delayed. You insult someone today, nothing happens. You mistreat an employee, nothing happens. You betray someone's trust, nothing happens. You abuse authority, nothing happens. And because nothing happens immediately, the human mind makes a dangerous conclusion. Nothing will happen. That is where arrogance begins to grow. The absence of immediate consequences is mistaken for the absence of consequences altogether. But delayed consequences are accumulating everywhere, in reputation, relationships, health, organizations, politics, families, businesses, and history. A person can behave badly for years while appearing completely successful. Then suddenly everything changes. Observers say, the fall came from nowhere. Usually it did not. They simply could not see what had been accumulating. Consider debt. A person borrows money. Nothing terrible happens. They borrow again. Still nothing. They continue. Their lifestyle improves. People admire them. For a while, debt can look exactly like wealth. Then the payments become too large. Income changes. Interest accumulates. Suddenly, the same structure that created the appearance of success becomes the mechanism of collapse. Power can work similarly. A person accumulates obedience through fear. At first, it looks like leadership. Nobody challenges them. Everyone agrees. Decisions happen quickly. The organization appears disciplined. But underneath the surface, another form of debt is accumulating. Resentment, silence, distrust, bad information, people waiting to leave, people hiding mistakes, people pretending loyalty. The powerful person sees obedience. They do not see the debt. Then circumstances change, and the bill arrives. This is why one of the most dangerous experiences in life is getting away with something repeatedly. Success can teach the wrong lesson. You make a reckless decision and survive. Instead of thinking, I was fortunate, you think, I am brilliant. You mistreat someone and they remain silent. Instead of thinking, perhaps they are being patient, you think they are weak. You abuse authority and nobody stops you. Instead of thinking, this system lacks accountability, you think, I deserve this power. Every successful violation strengthens the illusion, until eventually you stop recognizing risk. This is the psychology of invulnerability. And history is filled with powerful people who suffered from it. Julius Caesar offers one of the most famous examples. By the middle of the 1st century before Christ, the Roman Republic was already experiencing profound political instability. Competition among elites had become intense. Violence had entered politics. Military commanders accumulated personal loyalty from armies. Traditional institutions were under enormous pressure. Caesar rose inside this unstable system. He was ambitious, politically skilled, an extraordinary military commander. His campaigns in Gaul brought wealth, prestige, and loyal soldiers. But his growing power intensified conflict with political rivals. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army, beginning a civil war. He eventually defeated his opponents. His authority expanded, honors accumulated around him. In 44 BC, he was appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. To his supporters, Caesar offered order after years of instability. To some senators, his growing power represented an existential threat to the Republic and to their own political position. Then came the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC. Caesar entered a meeting of the Senate. A group of conspirators surrounded him, and one of the most powerful men in the Roman world was stabbed to death. The conspirators believed they were saving the Republic, but assassination did not restore the old political order. Instead, Rome descended into further civil wars. Eventually, Caesar's adopted heir Octavian emerged victorious and became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. This is one of history's great ironies. The conspirators killed Caesar partly because they feared monarchy. The result was not restoration of the old republic. It was another sequence of conflicts that ultimately produced imperial rule. Consequences are unpredictable. That is the point. Once political systems enter cycles of fear, humiliation, revenge, and violence, nobody fully controls what happens next. The person who begins escalation cannot guarantee where escalation ends. This applies to ordinary life too. A manager humiliates an employee. The manager thinks the event is finished. But perhaps the employee tells colleagues. Other stories emerge. Someone documents incidents. A complaint reaches senior leadership. Or perhaps nothing formal happens. The best employees simply leave. Recruitment becomes harder. Reputation spreads. The manager's career stagnates. The original humiliation lasted 3 minutes. The consequences unfold over years. This is why reputation matters. Reputation is essentially accumulated memory. What do people expect from you based on what they have seen, heard, and experienced? A good reputation can create opportunities before you enter the room. A bad reputation can close doors before you know they existed. And reputation is especially important because you do not control it completely. You control behavior. Other people interpret behavior. They talk. Patterns emerge. Eventually, a social judgment forms. This is why the person who repeatedly bullies others may be building an invisible prison around themselves. At first, everyone comes close. Then people learn. Do not tell them too much. Do not disagree publicly. Do not trust them. Do not work with them if you have another option. Do not become vulnerable around them. The bully still has people nearby. But genuine relationships disappear. They have an audience, not allies. They have employees, not loyalty. They have followers, not friends. Power can hide this loneliness for years. As long as money, authority, fame, or status remain, people continue arriving. That creates another illusion. Everyone loves me. But power attracts many different motivations. Some people admire you, some need you, some fear you, some want access, some want opportunity, some simply want proximity to status. The true test of relationships often arrives when the advantage disappears. Lose the title, lose the money, lose the influence, lose the ability to provide opportunities. Now look around, who remains? That question has humbled powerful people throughout history. The Roman Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself of the temporary nature of fame and status. He understood something modern culture constantly encourages us to forget. Every hierarchy is temporary. The emperor dies. The servant dies. The famous become forgotten. The beautiful age. The strong become weaker. The wealthy eventually leave their wealth behind. Time is the ultimate destroyer of status. This does not mean achievement is meaningless. It means achievement should not become an excuse for arrogance, because whatever advantage makes you feel superior today is temporary in one form or another. Physical strength? Temporary. Beauty? Temporary. Job title? Temporary. Political office? Temporary. Money? You cannot take it beyond your lifetime. Even reputation eventually becomes history. Understanding impermanence should create perspective. The bully lives as though today's hierarchy is eternal. The wise person understands. Positions rotate. This is why you should pay attention to how people behave toward those who cannot benefit them. Watch someone speaking to a waiter, a cleaner, a driver, a receptionist, a junior employee, a child, someone who has made a mistake, someone who cannot retaliate. These interactions reveal something that conversations with powerful people often hide. Anyone can perform respect upward. Character becomes visible downward. But there is another kind of consequence we need to examine. Institutional blindness. When leaders punish disagreement, they destroy the mechanism that could save them. Imagine a company developing a dangerous product. An engineer sees a problem. They speak up. The manager humiliates them. Another employee notices another problem. They remember what happened. They remain silent. A third employee also remains silent. The leader walks into meetings and sees complete agreement. They think, excellent. My team believes in the strategy. But agreement has been manufactured. The organization is now flying without instruments. This phenomenon is connected to what organizational researchers call psychological safety. The term became strongly associated with Harvard professor Amy Edmondson's work. Psychological safety does not mean everyone is comfortable all the time. It does not mean standards disappear. It means people believe they can speak up with questions, concerns, mistakes, or dissent without being punished simply for raising them. This matters enormously in complex systems. Hospitals, airlines, engineering, military organizations, technology companies, construction. Anywhere mistakes can become expensive, You want bad news to travel quickly. The bully creates the opposite environment. Bad news becomes dangerous to deliver, so everyone delays. They soften it, hide it, or wait for someone else. Eventually, reality delivers the message instead, and reality is less polite. This is why leaders who cannot tolerate criticism often create the conditions for their own failure. They think criticism weakens authority, but criticism can protect authority from stupidity. The person who tells you, "This plan has a problem," may be more loyal than the person who says, "Everything looks perfect." Flattery feels good. Truth is useful. Powerful people often receive too much of the first and too little of the second. That is why humility is strategically valuable. Humility does not mean thinking you are incompetent. It means recognizing the possibility that you are wrong, that one idea can save organizations. "I might be wrong," 4 words, but the bully struggles to say them, because their identity depends on superiority. If I admit error, perhaps people will think I am weak. So they defend mistakes, blame others, punish messengers, rewrite events. And gradually a small error becomes a large one. This is how ego converts mistakes into disasters. A mistake is often recoverable. The refusal to admit the mistake may not be. Napoleon's Russian campaign demonstrated overreach at a military scale. But similar patterns appear in business. Consider Kodak. For much of the 20th century, Kodak was one of the world's dominant photography companies. The brand was so deeply associated with consumer photography that the phrase Kodak moment entered popular language. Ironically, a Kodak engineer, Stephen Sasson, developed an early digital camera prototype in the 1970s. The company was not simply unaware of digital technology. That common story is too simplistic. Kodak invested in digital imaging and understood that technological change was coming. Its deeper challenge was adapting a highly profitable business built around film, chemicals, processing, and printing to a world where digital photography undermined the economics of that ecosystem. Kodak eventually filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 2012. The lesson is more useful when we avoid mythology. Successful organizations can understand that change is happening and still struggle to transform themselves. Why? Because existing success creates commitments, business models, employees, factories, investor expectations, internal incentives, organizational identity. The thing that made you powerful yesterday can become the thing that makes adaptation difficult tomorrow. This is true for bullies too. Aggression may have worked, fear may have produced obedience, intimidation may have built status. So when conditions change, the person doubles down on the old method. More intimidation, more control, more humiliation. They cannot imagine another form of power because the old form built their identity. Eventually, adaptation becomes impossible. This is why power should never become your personality. A job title is something you have. It is not what you are. Money is something you possess. It is not your human value. Physical strength is an ability. It is not moral superiority. Authority is a responsibility. It is not evidence that you are inherently better than the people beneath you. The moment these distinctions disappear, arrogance enters. And arrogance makes consequences harder to see. There is another consequence of bullying that rarely appears immediately: the creation of enemies. Most people do not need many enemies to make life difficult. One determined enemy with information can create enormous problems. One former employee who knows the organization. One business partner who understands your weaknesses. One family member who knows your secrets. One political rival who understands your habits. This does not mean living in paranoia. It means understanding a simple strategic principle. Why create unnecessary hostility? If conflict is necessary, face it. If someone threatens you, protect yourself. If misconduct requires consequences, impose them. But cruelty for entertainment is expensive. Humiliation for ego is expensive. Breaking trust for small advantages is expensive. Because the return is tiny and the potential downside is unpredictable. Robert Greene repeatedly explores this kind of asymmetry in his writing about power. Human beings remember injuries to pride, and the person you humiliate may not respond when you expect. That delayed response is what makes the situation dangerous. They may wait, not necessarily for revenge, perhaps simply for independence, and independence itself can become a consequence. The controlling parent grows old and discovers the children rarely visit. The abusive manager loses talented staff. The arrogant business owner loses trusted partners. The bully grows older and discovers that fear did not produce friendship. Nobody attacks them. Nobody needs to. People simply leave. This is an important point because consequences do not always look like punishment. Sometimes the consequence is absence. People stop inviting you, stop trusting you, stop sharing information, stop recommending you, stop answering your calls, stop caring what happens to you. No dramatic revenge, no cinematic confrontation, just doors quietly closing. That may be one of the most powerful forms of consequence, because you cannot force genuine affection. You cannot command trust. You cannot threaten someone into respecting you. You can control behavior for a period, but internal loyalty belongs to the other person. This is why fear is a weak foundation for relationships. It requires constant maintenance. Respect is more durable, and that brings us to the deepest lesson of this chapter. Power without wisdom creates its own vulnerabilities. The more people fear you, the less honest information you receive. The more people hate you, the more they wait for weakness. The more you humiliate people, the more reputational debt you accumulate. The more you depend on intimidation, the more fragile you become when your power declines. The bully thinks strength means, nobody can hurt me. Wisdom understands, everyone is vulnerable somewhere. Your reputation, your relationships, your health, your business, your family, your position, your future. Nobody is untouchable. That realization should not create fear. It should create humility, because humility changes how you use strength. You stop needing unnecessary victories. You stop enjoying humiliation. You begin preserving relationships where possible. You listen more carefully. You distinguish disagreement from disrespect. You understand that someone can challenge your idea without challenging your worth. And perhaps most importantly, you stop confusing kindness with weakness. Because the strongest people sometimes choose restraint precisely because they understand what conflict costs. This leads us toward another model of power. Power without cruelty, authority without humiliation, strength without insecurity, the ability to enforce boundaries while preserving dignity, the ability to win without needing another person to crawl. Because perhaps the greatest evidence of strength is not how destructive you become when you have power. It is how little unnecessary destruction you need. And that is where we go next. What does strength look like when it no longer needs cruelty? What separates the feared leader from the respected one? And why do some people become more humane as they become more powerful, while others become monsters? The answer begins with one of the hardest forms of power any human being can develop: power over oneself. Chapter 9. Without cruelty. There is a mistake people often make when talking about kindness. They confuse kindness with weakness. They imagine the strong person as aggressive, loud, intimidating, dominant, someone who never backs down, someone who answers every insult, someone everyone fears, and they imagine the kind person as passive, soft, harmless, someone who avoids confrontation because they are incapable of handling it. But these are false categories. A person can be kind because they are weak, and a person can be kind because they are strong enough not to need cruelty. Those are completely different things. The person who cannot fight and says, "I choose peace," has made a different decision from the person who could fight, understands the cost, and still chooses restraint. Restraint only becomes meaningful when alternatives exist. This is why strength matters, because the goal of this documentary is not to create harmless people. It is to create controlled people. Capable people, people who can defend themselves, set boundaries, say no, walk away, compete, lead, confront wrongdoing, and when necessary, impose consequences, but who do not need to humiliate others simply to feel powerful. That distinction is essential, because weakness and goodness are not the same thing. Sometimes people behave politely because they are afraid. They call it patience, but internally they are terrified of conflict. They tolerate disrespect because they cannot establish boundaries. They forgive repeatedly because they fear losing the relationship. They say, "I am choosing peace," but perhaps peace was never a choice. Perhaps they believed they had no alternative. Real strength expands alternatives. You can stay or leave, speak or remain silent, fight or walk away, forgive or create distance. When you possess options, your choices become more meaningful. And this is why one of the most important goals in life is becoming capable, physically capable where possible, financially capable, emotionally capable, intellectually capable, socially capable. not so you can dominate everyone around you. So you are not easily dominated. There is a difference. The bully develops strength in order to control. The mature person develops strength in order to remain free. And once freedom exists, restraint becomes possible. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes especially useful. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius possessed extraordinary external power. He was not writing philosophy from a position of political helplessness. He commanded the Roman state. Armies fought under imperial authority. Governors administered provinces in his name. His decisions could affect enormous numbers of people. Yet when Marcus wrote privately to himself in the reflections we now call meditations, he repeatedly returned to self-command. Control your anger. Examine your judgments. Remember that fame disappears. Remember that other people act according to what seems right to them. Remember that you too make mistakes. Remember death. Remember how temporary everything is. Why would one of the most powerful men in the world need to remind himself of these things? Because external power does not eliminate internal weakness. Sometimes it magnifies it. Imagine having anger without authority. You shout, perhaps a few people suffer. Now imagine having anger in an empire. Your emotions have consequences. The more power you possess, the more dangerous your lack of self-control becomes. This is why leadership requires internal discipline. If every irritation becomes policy, everyone suffers. If every disagreement becomes betrayal, nobody can speak honestly. If every criticism becomes an attack on your ego, you eventually surround yourself with flatterers. The leader becomes psychologically weaker while appearing politically stronger. Marcus Aurelius understood that the first territory a powerful person must govern is themselves. That principle applies far beyond emperors. Before you control employees, control your temper. Before you lead children, examine your own habits. Before you demand loyalty, become trustworthy. Before you criticize weakness in others, understand your own. This is difficult, much more difficult than shouting. Anyone can lose control. Self-command takes practice. And this leads us to another misconception. People often believe that calmness means lack of intensity. But calmness can be concentrated strength. Consider the difference between an uncontrolled fire and a furnace. The uncontrolled fire burns whatever it reaches. The furnace contains heat and directs it toward a purpose. Both possess energy. Only one has discipline. Human anger works similarly. Anger can tell you that a boundary has been crossed, that something matters, that injustice exists. The problem is not always feeling anger. The problem is allowing anger to choose your behavior. A disciplined person can feel anger and still ask, what response produces the best outcome? That question transforms emotion into strategy. Sometimes the answer is confrontation, sometimes documentation, sometimes legal action, sometimes leaving, sometimes forgiveness, sometimes silence, sometimes immediate protection. The correct response depends on the situation, but the response is chosen, not merely triggered. That is power. The person who can be triggered into predictable behavior is easier to control than they realize. Insult them. They attack. Question them. They become defensive. Ignore them. They become desperate for attention. Praise them. They become easy to manipulate. This is why ego is such a strategic vulnerability. If I know exactly what your ego needs, I know which buttons to press. The disciplined person becomes harder to manipulate because they do not need every social interaction to confirm their identity. This is one reason truly capable people can sometimes appear surprisingly relaxed. They do not need to win every argument because their life does not depend on the argument. They do not need everyone to recognize their intelligence. They know what they know. They can say, I don't know. They can admit, I was wrong. They can apologize. They can change their mind. These behaviors appear weak only to insecure people. In reality, they require a stable identity. The bully cannot easily apologize because apology feels like status loss. The secure person can apologize because one mistake does not destroy their sense of self. This distinction is crucial in leadership. Imagine two managers. Both make the same bad decision. The first manager discovers the mistake and says, I made the wrong call. We need to change direction. The team learns something. Truth matters more than ego. The second manager refuses to admit the mistake. They blame an employee, manipulate the numbers, attack anyone who questions the decision. Now the original mistake becomes larger. The team learns something else. Protect the leader's ego. Which organization becomes stronger? The one where reality can be spoken. Strength without cruelty is therefore closely connected to truth. You do not need to humiliate someone for bringing information you dislike. You need the information. This is where the best leaders often distinguish themselves. They create environments where people can disagree without becoming enemies. That does not mean democracy in every decision. A leader still decides. A commander still commands. A parent still sets boundaries. But people can speak before the decision is made. This reduces blindness, and it creates respect. Respect is fundamentally different from fear. Fear says I obey because of what you can do to me. Respect says I recognize something valuable in you. Competence, integrity, courage, fairness, wisdom, consistency. Fear depends heavily on external power. Respect can survive its disappearance. This is why some leaders remain influential long after leaving office. They no longer control institutions. People still listen. Their authority has become partly moral rather than merely positional. Nelson Mandela provides an important example. When Mandela became president of South Africa in 1994, he gained formal political authority. But much of his influence did not come from the presidency alone. It came from biography, sacrifice, symbolism, restraint, and the belief that he represented something larger than personal revenge. He could not solve every problem. No leader can. His presidency has legitimate critics. Post-apartheid South Africa continued to face enormous inequality and social problems. But Mandela understood the symbolic responsibility of power. He knew that every gesture could communicate what kind of country was being created. This is one reason his approach toward former opponents mattered. He could be firm about dismantling apartheid while avoiding the message that every white South African had become an enemy. That distinction helped create political space for transition. This is what strength without cruelty looks like politically. You can defeat a system without needing to dehumanize every person associated with the other side. You can demand justice without making humiliation the central objective. You can protect yourself without worshiping revenge. And this principle applies to personal life. Suppose someone betrays you. Strength does not require pretending it did not happen. You can end the relationship. Strength does not require destroying their reputation unnecessarily. Suppose an employee repeatedly fails to perform. You may need to terminate them. Strength does not require enjoying their humiliation. Suppose a child violates an important rule. Consequences may be necessary. Strength does not require attacking their worth. Suppose someone challenges you publicly. Perhaps you must respond. Strength does not require turning every disagreement into lifelong warfare. This is controlled power. And controlled power creates something bullying cannot. Trust. People trust someone who has power but does not abuse it. Think about why. If someone is incapable of hurting you, their kindness tells you relatively little. Perhaps they have no choice. But when someone has the ability to exploit you and consistently chooses fairness, you learn something about their character. They have limits, principles, self-control. This is why ethical power can become deeply attractive. People want to cooperate with someone strong enough to protect them, but disciplined enough not to exploit them. This is the foundation of good leadership. Capability plus restraint. Remove capability and you have helplessness. Remove restraint and you have tyranny. Combine them and you have something much more durable. Authority people can trust. This principle appears in parenting. Children need protection. They also need boundaries. A parent who refuses to establish boundaries may create insecurity because the child has no stable structure. But a parent who uses humiliation as the primary method of discipline creates another problem. The child learns fear rather than judgment. The strongest parent is neither permissive nor tyrannical. They are predictable. The child understands there are rules, there are consequences, but my mistakes do not remove my basic worth. That distinction allows discipline and dignity to coexist. The same principle appears in education. A demanding teacher can transform a student's life. High standards are not bullying. Sometimes the teacher who believes you can do better refuses to accept mediocre work. That can be an act of respect. The key difference is intention and method. The teacher says, this work is below your ability. Do it again. Not, you are hopeless. One attacks performance, the other attacks identity. This distinction should become part of every form of leadership. Correct the behavior without unnecessarily destroying the person, because today's beginner may become tomorrow's expert. And even if they do not, dignity remains valuable. There is another reason strong people should avoid cruelty. Cruelty changes the person using it. Every action is also practice. When you lie repeatedly, lying becomes easier. When you lose your temper repeatedly, anger becomes habitual. When you humiliate people repeatedly, empathy becomes less natural. You are not only doing something to another person, you are training yourself. This is one of the deepest insights in ancient ethics. Character is built through repeated action. Aristotle emphasized habit in the formation of virtue. We become courageous by practicing courageous action, temperate by practicing restraint, just by practicing justice. The reverse also follows. Repeated cruelty can become character. The first humiliation may feel uncomfortable. The 10th becomes easier. The 100th becomes normal. Eventually, the person stops noticing what they have become. This is why small abuses of power matter. They are rehearsals. Every time you discover you can mistreat someone without consequences, a temptation appears to repeat it. If repeated often enough, cruelty becomes part of your identity. Then you need larger doses of domination to feel powerful. The bully becomes trapped by the role they created. Everyone expects aggression, so they must keep performing aggression. Any kindness now looks like weakness. Any apology looks like surrender. Any compromise looks like defeat. The bully has built a prison out of their own reputation. They can no longer behave normally without feeling that they are losing status. That is not power. That is captivity. The strongest person is free to choose. They can be firm today and compassionate tomorrow. They can fight when necessary and cooperate when possible. They can change tactics because their identity is not attached to one performance. This flexibility is strength, and it requires something the bully rarely develops: security. The secure person does not need weaker people around them. They can mentor talented people without fearing replacement. They can celebrate someone else's success. They can employ people smarter than themselves. They can teach someone who may eventually surpass them. Think about the confidence required for that. The insecure leader wants permanent dependence. The secure leader develops independence. A weak manager secretly wants employees who cannot survive without them. A strong manager creates employees who may eventually become leaders themselves. A weak parent wants children who remain psychologically dependent. A strong parent understands that successful parenting eventually produces adults who can stand without the parent. A weak teacher wants students who remain impressed by the teacher. A great teacher hopes students eventually know more. This is the paradox of healthy power. Its greatest achievement is sometimes making itself less necessary. Bullying does the opposite. Bullying needs dependence. It needs someone beneath, someone afraid, someone available to absorb frustration. Without that person, the bully loses part of their identity. This is why we should not aspire merely to become powerful. We should aspire to become the kind of person who can safely possess power. That is harder. Money amplifies, authority amplifies, fame amplifies, technology amplifies, strength amplifies. They give your character a larger stage. If you are generous, resources increase what you can build. If you are insecure, resources increase the scale of your insecurity. If you are disciplined, authority increases your capacity to organize. If you are cruel, authority increases the number of people your cruelty can reach. Power is therefore not only a prize, it is an amplifier. And the question becomes, what exactly are you amplifying? This is why self-mastery must come before domination. Learn to control anger before acquiring authority. Learn to tolerate disagreement before becoming a leader. Learn to handle money before becoming wealthy. Learn to handle attention before becoming famous. Learn to handle strength before deciding what strength means. Otherwise, the very thing you prayed for can reveal weaknesses you never corrected. And eventually we arrive at the central principle of this entire documentary. Do not become harmless. Become disciplined. There are people in the world who will exploit weakness. Boundaries matter. Consequences matter. Courage matters. Strength matters. But strength without restraint becomes cruelty. And restraint without strength can become helplessness. The goal is the combination. Be capable of defending yourself, but do not search for people to attack. Be capable of leaving, but do not threaten departure every time your ego is challenged. Be capable of confrontation, but do not turn every disagreement into war. Be capable of power, but do not need humiliation to experience it. That is strength without cruelty, and it produces something fear never can: respect. The bully asks, how many people can I control? The leader asks, how many people become stronger because I was here? The bully creates dependence. The leader creates capability. The bully creates silence. The leader creates enough safety for truth. The bully wants everyone to know who is above them. The leader understands that hierarchy is temporary. And perhaps the greatest test comes when nobody can stop you, when you could exploit someone, but you do not, when you could humiliate someone, but correction is enough, when you could take revenge, but justice is enough, when you could destroy an opponent. But the objective does not require destruction. That is not weakness. That is power governed by character. And once we understand that, we arrive at the final lesson. Because every relationship we have examined, the bully and the victim, the leader and the follower, the parent and the child, the manager and the employee, the powerful and the powerless, eventually comes back to one principle: respect. Not respect based on fear, not respect based on wealth, not respect reserved only for people above you. Something deeper: the recognition that every human being is unfinished, that circumstances change, that power changes hands, that today's beginner may become tomorrow's leader, and that the way you treat people when they have nothing to offer you may reveal more about your character than anything else. That is where our story ends, with the law of respect, and the person you ignore today, who may become someone you never expected tomorrow. Chapter 10, the law of respect. There is one thing you can never fully see when you look at another human being: their future. You can see their clothes, their job, their money, their education, their mistakes, their reputation, their current abilities. You can see where they stand today, but you cannot see where life will take them. And that uncertainty should make arrogance difficult. Because every human being you meet is unfinished. The student is unfinished. The employee is unfinished. The struggling business owner is unfinished. The poor person is unfinished. The young person is unfinished. The person recovering from failure is unfinished. Even the successful person is unfinished. You are unfinished. Life is movement. And one of the greatest mistakes we make is turning temporary positions into permanent identities. He is poor. She is unsuccessful. He is weak. She is inexperienced. He is nobody. But these statements often contain a hidden word. Today. He is poor today. She is struggling today. He is inexperienced today. She has little influence today. Once you add that word, the entire meaning changes. Because today expires. This is the law of respect. Treat people according to their humanity, not merely according to their current usefulness. That sounds simple, but human beings struggle with it. We are remarkably sensitive to status. Put an ordinary person in simple clothing and many people barely notice them. Give the same person an expensive suit, a title, security guards, and a famous name, and suddenly everyone becomes polite. Doors open. People laugh harder at their jokes. Their opinions become more interesting. Their mistakes become eccentricities. Their presence changes the room. What changed? Perhaps nothing inside the person. What changed was our perception of their status. This tells us something uncomfortable about human respect. Sometimes what we call respect is merely submission to hierarchy. We do not respect the person, we respect what the person controls: money, access, authority, opportunity, consequences. That is not always wrong. Roles matter. A judge deserves institutional respect in court. Teacher has authority in a classroom. A manager has responsibilities employees do not. A parent has responsibilities a young child cannot carry. Hierarchy can be necessary, but hierarchy and human worth are not the same thing. This distinction separates mature societies from primitive domination. A cleaner and a chief executive do not have the same responsibilities, but both have dignity. A student and a professor do not possess the same knowledge, but both have dignity. A prisoner may legitimately lose certain freedoms after committing a crime, but punishment does not automatically erase humanity. A defeated opponent has lost the contest. They have not ceased to be human. Civilization depends partly on our ability to preserve these distinctions. Power can establish order, Respect determines what kind of order we create. Confucius understood the importance of relationships in maintaining social stability. His philosophy emerged in a world deeply concerned with disorder. He emphasized duties within relationships: ruler and subject, parent and child, older and younger, friend and friend. These relationships were not imagined simply as permission for the person above to dominate. The person with greater authority also carried greater obligations. This principle matters because modern people often talk about respect as though it should move only upward. Respect your elders. Respect your boss. Respect your teacher. Respect authority. Sometimes correct, but authority must also understand responsibility. The parent should respect the child's humanity. The teacher should respect the student's potential. The manager should respect the employee's dignity. The ruler should respect the people affected by power. Respect is strongest when it travels in both directions. This does not eliminate hierarchy. It civilizes it. The bully understands only one direction: respect upward, pressure downward. Around powerful people, the bully becomes polite. Around vulnerable people, they become cruel. That tells you their politeness was never character. It was calculation. Character appears when calculation offers no reward. How do you treat someone who cannot help you? That is the test. How do you treat the waiter after the food arrives late? How do you treat the employee after they make an honest mistake? How do you treat the child who cannot defend themselves? How do you treat someone whose English is imperfect? Someone with less education? Someone who has lost everything? Someone who walks into a room where nobody knows their name? These moments rarely appear on resumes, but they reveal the architecture of character. Because anyone can be humble in front of someone more powerful. The difficult humility is downward, and history repeatedly reminds us why this matters. Abraham Lincoln was born far from the centers of elite American power. His path to the presidency was not obvious. Nelson Mandela spent decades as a prisoner before becoming president. Epictetus experienced slavery before becoming one of antiquity's most influential philosophers. People rise from circumstances that appear permanent while they are living inside them. But there is another side. People fall. Julius Caesar accumulated extraordinary power and was assassinated. Napoleon dominated much of Europe and ended his life in exile on St. Helena. Monarchies disappear, companies collapse, political parties lose elections, famous people are forgotten, fortunes vanish, bodies age, positions reverse. History has an almost cruel way of reminding human beings that status is temporary, and yet every generation behaves as though it has discovered permanent power. This time will be different. My company cannot fail. My position is secure. My wealth protects. My influence will last. Everyone needs me until they do not. This is why humility is not merely a religious or philosophical virtue. It is accurate perception. You are temporary. So am I. So is everyone watching this documentary. One day another generation will occupy our houses, our jobs, our offices, our cities. They will use technologies we cannot imagine. They may barely remember the arguments that consume us today. And eventually, even our names will disappear. That sounds dark, but it can be liberating. If status is temporary, you do not need to spend your life proving superiority. If everyone eventually leaves the stage, perhaps the more interesting question is, what did you do while you were here? Did people become smaller around you, or stronger? Did you create fear, or capability? Did you use knowledge to embarrass beginners, or teach them? Did you use money to humiliate people with less, or create something valuable? Did you use authority to silence disagreement, or build an environment where truth could survive? Did you use physical strength to intimidate, or protect? These are questions of legacy. And legacy is not limited to famous people. Most of us will never have statues. Most of us will never become presidents. Most of us will never appear in history books. But everyone leaves small legacies. In families, friendships, workplaces, communities. Children remember, students remember, employees remember, friends remember, sometimes strangers remember. Perhaps years ago someone encouraged you at exactly the right moment. They may have forgotten the conversation. You did not. Perhaps someone humiliated you when you were vulnerable. They forgot. You remember every detail. This is how human influence works. We often do not know which moments will survive inside another person. That should make us careful, not terrified. Careful, Because words can become internal voices. A teacher tells a child, "You have talent. Keep working." 20 years later, that sentence may still exist. A parent says, "You will never become anything." 20 years later, that sentence may also exist. Both speakers may have forgotten. The listener may carry the words for decades. Power is often exercised in moments the powerful person considers insignificant. That is why respect matters most when it seems unnecessary. This does not mean living timidly. You will offend people. Sometimes necessarily, you will disappoint people. You will say no. You will enforce boundaries. You will criticize poor work. You will compete. You may win. You may have to remove people from your life. You may need to confront dishonesty. Respect does not mean becoming incapable of conflict. It means not adding unnecessary degradation to necessary action. If someone must be corrected, correct them. You do not need to destroy their identity. If someone must leave your company, let them leave with as much dignity as circumstances permit. If a relationship must end, ending it does not require a campaign of humiliation. If you defeat a competitor, you do not need to mock their failure. If someone is weaker than you, their weakness is not an invitation. It is information, and sometimes responsibility. This is especially important for men and women who deliberately pursue strength. There is nothing wrong with wanting strength. Become physically stronger. Become financially stronger. Become intellectually stronger. Build influence. Develop useful skills. Become difficult to manipulate. Become capable of protecting the people who depend on you. The world contains exploitation. Naivety is not virtue. Helplessness is not morality. But remember why you became strong. If you escaped weakness only to spend your life hunting weaker people, you misunderstood the entire journey. Strength should expand what you can protect, what you can build, what you can endure, what you can contribute. The strongest person should not automatically become the greatest threat in the room. Sometimes they should become the reason everyone else feels safer. That is a very different philosophy of power. Power is stewardship. You have more, therefore more is expected from you. More knowledge? Teach. More money? Use it intelligently. More authority? Carry responsibility. More experience? Guide. More physical strength? Protect. More emotional stability. Do not exploit someone else's instability. This is what mature strength looks like, and it is far more difficult than bullying. Bullying is easy. Find someone weaker. Apply pressure. Enjoy the reaction. Strength under restraint requires more. It requires self-awareness, patience, confidence, judgment, empathy, discipline, and the ability to control ego when ego desperately wants a performance. This brings us back to the person standing silently in the first chapter of our story. The bully looked at them and thought, weak. But perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they were patient. Perhaps they were gathering strength. Perhaps they were simply surviving. We did not know. And that was the point. We never completely know another person's future. So be careful with conclusions. The quiet child may become an extraordinary adult. The struggling employee may become an entrepreneur. The inexperienced student may become an expert. The person recovering from failure may eventually become stronger because of what they learned. Or perhaps none of these things happen. Perhaps the person remains ordinary. That does not reduce the obligation to treat them with dignity. This distinction is important. Do not respect people merely because they might become powerful. That is still worshiping power. Respect them because dignity should not depend on status. And if they do become powerful one day, you will have something better than the satisfaction of saying, "I treated them well because I knew they would succeed." You will know, "I treated them well when there was nothing to gain." That is character. There is also a lesson for anyone who has been bullied. Do not allow another person's cruelty to become your identity. What happened matters. But what happened is not everything you are. Build yourself. Seek help when you need it. Learn. Develop skills. Create options. Leave environments that repeatedly destroy your dignity when leaving is possible. Set boundaries. Find people who tell you the truth without needing to humiliate you. And do not confuse healing with revenge. You do not need your bully to fail for you to succeed. You do not need them to apologize before you begin living. You do not need to spend the next 20 years proving that they were wrong. Become free. That is enough. And when you finally become strong, remember what weakness felt like. Do not become addicted to the opportunity to reverse positions. Do not say, "Now it is my turn." Say, "It ends with me. The humiliation ends with me. The unnecessary cruelty ends with me." The tradition of hurting beginners because I was hurt as a beginner ends with me. The family pattern ends with me. The workplace culture ends with me. The cycle ends with me. That is how human beings improve the world, not through perfection, through interruption. One person receives pain and refuses to pass all of it forward. One parent changes. One teacher changes. One manager changes. One leader changes. One generation changes. That may not sound as dramatic as revenge, but it is far more revolutionary because revenge changes positions. Wisdom changes patterns. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Do not bully too much. In fact, if bullying means using unnecessary power to degrade someone weaker, do not bully at all. Be strong, but do not worship domination. Be ambitious, but do not need another person's humiliation to measure your progress. Compete, but know when the contest is over. Defend yourself, but do not become addicted to retaliation. Gain power, but remember what power reveals, because one day you will meet someone who cannot fight back. Someone who needs you, someone with less knowledge, less money, less confidence, less authority. Someone at the beginning of the journey you have already traveled, and in that moment nobody may be watching. There may be no reward for kindness, no punishment for cruelty. You may be able to say anything, do anything, take advantage, humiliate, dominate, and get away with it. That is the moment, not when you are standing before someone stronger, not when your reputation is being watched, not when consequences are obvious. When you have the advantage and nothing appears capable of stopping you, that is the moment your character is revealed. Because power does not only show us what we can do, it shows us who we are when we can do almost anything. So when that moment arrives, remember the law of respect. Today's hierarchy is temporary. Today's weakness is temporary. Today's strength is temporary. Today's humiliation may be remembered long after you forget delivering it. And the person standing beneath you possesses something you cannot see. A future. Maybe an extraordinary one, maybe an ordinary one. Either way, it belongs to a human being. Treat it accordingly. Because eventually the titles disappear, the money changes hands. The offices belong to someone else. The applause moves toward another person. The strong grow old. The famous become photographs. And what remains for a while longer is memory. How did this person make people feel when they had power? Did they make the weak afraid, or make them stronger? Did they demand respect, or become worthy of it? That is the difference between intimidation and leadership, between domination and strength, between having power and deserving it. Never confuse someone's silence with weakness. Never confuse dependence with loyalty. Never confuse fear with respect. Never assume today's hierarchy will survive tomorrow. And above all, never become so powerful that you forget what it felt like to be powerless. Because the greatest achievement is not rising high enough that nobody can bully you. It is rising high enough that you could bully others and discovering that you no longer need to. That is strength. That is discipline. That is character. And that is the law of respect.